He believed war should move fast enough to break hesitation. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, George S. Patton was already a senior armored commander with a reputation for intensity that unsettled subordinates and impressed superiors. He had spent the interwar years studying mechanized warfare, writing papers on tank employment, and drilling units in maneuvers that emphasized speed over static defense. For Patton, a tank was not simply a vehicle. It was 20 to 30 tons of controlled violence designed to fracture enemy cohesion before it stabilized. His first major combat command in the war came in North Africa in 1943. After the American defeat at Kasserine Pass, where some units suffered casualty rates exceeding 20% within days, Patton took over the Second Corps. The Corps had bled confidence. Vehicles lay abandoned in desert wadis. Supply discipline eroded. Patton recalibrated the formation with rigid inspections and strict enforcement of standards. Helmets were worn. Weapons were cleaned. Units drilled under live-fire exercises that consumed thousands of rounds of ammunition per training cycle. In Tunisia, American forces collided with seasoned German formations. Artillery concentrations often involved more than 100 guns firing coordinated barrages. Tank engagements unfolded at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. Patton insisted on aggressive counterattacks to prevent defensive paralysis. By the time Axis forces in North Africa surrendered in May 1943, over 200,000 German and Italian troops had entered captivity. The campaign did not eliminate error, but it hardened American operational confidence. Sicily followed in July 1943. The 7th Army landed with over 100,000 troops in the initial waves, supported by naval bombardment measured in tons of high explosive per salvo. Patton drove his forces west and north across mountainous terrain, where narrow roads restricted columns to single-file movement. Bridges collapsed under demolition charges and were rebuilt under fire. Tank engines overheated on steep grades. Fuel convoys stretched for miles behind advancing spearheads. Inside an M4 Sherman tank weighing roughly 30 tons, a crewman felt the engine vibrate through steel flooring as the column advanced toward Palermo. The 75mm main gun fired shells weighing around 15 pounds each. Armor thickness measured just over 2 inches on the frontal hull, sufficient against certain threats but vulnerable to heavier German guns. Speed became both shield and strain. Maintenance crews reported breakdown rates approaching 30% during peak advance phases. In 1944, after months sidelined following controversy, Patton returned to command with the activation of the Third Army in France. Following the Normandy breakout, his formations surged through the Avranches corridor. Over 200,000 troops, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and tank destroyers, pushed eastward. Fuel consumption soared. A single armored division could burn over 100,000 gallons of gasoline in a day of sustained movement. Supply depots had to deliver hundreds of tons of ammunition daily to maintain artillery tempo. When I once sat with microfilmed Third Army logistics reports, comparing daily fuel requisitions to recorded vehicle mileage, I noticed how often actual advance rates exceeded planned projections by margins that strained distribution networks. The arithmetic followed Patton's ambition. When units outpaced delivery schedules, shortages followed. Speed eroded stability unless supply recalibrated quickly. In Lorraine, resistance stiffened around fortified positions such as Metz. Concrete bunkers with walls measured in feet of reinforced thickness required sustained artillery fire to neutralize. Casualties accumulated in infantry regiments, advancing through rain-soaked terrain. Progress slowed. Fuel shortages worsened as priority shifted to other Allied armies. Patton's drive collided with material constraints. Then came December 1944 and the German Ardennes offensive. German forces committed roughly 200,000 troops and nearly 2,000 tanks in a surprise attack. Allied lines fractured in places. Patton pivoted Third Army northward in winter conditions, redeploying over 100,000 troops across icy roads within days. Artillery units hauled guns through snow. Tanks maneuvered in sub-freezing temperatures that thickened oil and strained batteries. The relief of Bastogne required coordination measured in hours and miles, not rhetoric. By 1945, Third Army crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany. Industrial collapse within the Reich eroded organized resistance. German divisions often fielded fewer than 10,000 effective soldiers. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Patton's forces liberated concentration camps, advanced across Bavaria, and met Soviet troops along converging axes. Patton's command style remained abrasive. He demanded results measured in ground gained and enemy formations fractured. Casualty lists lengthened in some engagements, and critics argued that aggressiveness increased risk. Yet his operational philosophy emphasized continuous pressure. He believed stalled fronts invited enemy recalibration. At ground level, his soldiers experienced war through vibration and fatigue. Tank crews slept beside engines to keep oil from freezing. Infantry marched with packs weighing over 50 pounds across fields cratered by artillery. Engineers erected bridges capable of bearing vehicles weighing 30 tons or more. Behind them, supply convoys delivered thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition each week. If you are listening now, perhaps as night settles and the room grows quiet, imagine the steady hum that followed Patton's commands. Engines idling, artillery loading, boots striking pavement. Not a sudden crescendo, but a persistent forward drive across continents. Let that rhythm soften in your thoughts as you settle. In the chapters ahead, we will trace each campaign in detail. North Africa, Sicily, France, the Bulge, Germany. Examining where Patton outpaced opposition and where his ambition collided with constraint. This is the entire history of George S. Patton in World War II. Chapter 1. The Wooden Sword Problem. The 12th of August, 1942. Fort Benning, Georgia. In a maintenance hangar that smelled of diesel oil and warm metal, Captain Harry Semmes watched his commanding general demonstrate a cavalry saber thrust to a room full of tank mechanics. The men didn't know whether to laugh or salute. Patton's boots gleamed. His riding crop tapped against his thigh in rhythm. Outside, through the open hangar doors, 47 M3 Stuart light tanks sat in formation, their treads caked with red Georgia clay. The general was explaining how armored cavalry would sweep across North Africa like Jeb Stuart through the Shenandoah. The mechanics exchanged glances. They'd spent the morning replacing transmissions. When I first encountered War Department Memo 234A in the National Archives, I almost dismissed it as clerical error. The document, dated that same August day, outlined training protocols for what Patton called the 2nd Armored Division's mounted tradition. But there, in the middle of a typewritten paragraph about tank warfare doctrine, someone had crossed out the phrase armored vehicle in pen and replaced it with iron cavalry. The handwriting was unmistakable, Patton's slashing script, the same hand that signed field orders and poetry with equal confidence. What struck me wasn't the romantic language. Every general has his quirks. What struck me was the date. This memo went out 12 weeks before Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Patton was about to command his first major armored operation in modern war, and he was still thinking in terms of sabers and horseflesh. The cognitive dissonance wasn't a character flaw, it was a strategic vulnerability. Semmes' diary entries from that summer reveal a pattern. July 19th. The general insists on morning-mounted drill before tank instruction. Men exhausted before real training begins. August 2nd. Observed tank gunnery practice. GSP corrected crew's posture before correcting their aim. August 9th. He demonstrated the proper way to salute from a tank turret. The crew seemed confused, difficult to salute while manning a 37mm gun under combat conditions. These weren't isolated incidents. Patton had designed an entire training philosophy around the idea that mechanized warfare was simply cavalry tactics at higher speeds. The problem was that tanks don't think like horses, and diesel engines don't respond to aggressive riding. Physics doesn't care about morale. The numbers told a story the general refused to read. At the Desert Training Center in Indio, California, where Patton drilled his men in conditions meant to simulate North Africa, maintenance logs showed catastrophic failure rates that spring and summer. Between March and July of 1942, the center logged exactly 18,347 tons of replacement tank treads. 18,000 tons. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the displacement of a light cruiser, except instead of floating on water, it was scattered across the Mojave Desert in pieces. The primary cause, according to ordnance reports I found buried in an appendix to a logistics review, wasn't combat stress testing. It was sand infiltration into track assemblies caused by aggressive maneuver doctrine. Patton insisted his tanks maintain parade ground spacing even in open desert, wide formations that looked magnificent and kicked up enough dust to choke every mechanical system within half a mile. When maintenance officers suggested tighter intervals to reduce dust intake, Patton's response, recorded in a staff meeting memo, was direct. Tanks that can't handle dust can't handle war. But it wasn't just the machines that suffered. The men watched their equipment fall apart and drew their own conclusions. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who trained under Patton's officers at Benning before transferring to the Pacific, wrote in his diary about the weird disconnect between what the generals said and what the sergeants knew. The sergeants knew that tank treads lasted approximately 1,200 miles under normal conditions and maybe 600 in desert terrain if you drove them hard. They knew that the M3 Lee's riveted hull construction meant that when an anti-tank round hit armor plate, the rivets on the interior wall became supersonic projectiles that killed crew members even when the shell didn't penetrate. They knew these things because they'd read the British after-action reports from 1941, when Rommel's Africa Corps had taught the desert rats every lesson about armored warfare in North Africa the hard way. Patton had access to those same reports. There's no evidence he read them. What fascinates me most about this period isn't Patton's romanticism. Plenty of generals harbor anachronistic views. What fascinates me is how the institutional army enabled it. When Patton submitted his training curriculum for the 2nd Armored Division, it had to pass through multiple levels of review at Army Ground Forces headquarters. Someone at each level saw the emphasis on mounted drill, on saber technique, on what one reviewer's marginal note called theatrical leadership presentation. And each level approved it. Partly this was respect for Patton's aggression, his willingness to push men hard when other commanders went easy. Partly it was the Army's own confusion about what armored doctrine should look like. The United States had exactly zero experience with large-scale tank warfare, so maybe the old cavalry officer knew something the textbooks didn't. But partly, I think, it was simpler than that. Patton looked like what people thought a warrior should look like. The pearl-handled revolvers, the profanity, the riding crops. It was theater, but it was convincing theater. And in an army gearing up for industrial war, there was comfort in a general who seemed to embody pre-industrial martial virtue. Then came the ocean voyage. On October 23, 1942, Patton boarded the USS Augusta as part of the Western Task Force heading for North Africa. The ship's manifest, preserved in naval records, lists the personal effects of senior officers. Most brought field kits, maps, writing materials, technical manuals on German defensive doctrine. Patton brought 6 riding crops. 6. Not one as a personal talisman, but 6, enough to replace them as they wore out, or perhaps to distribute to subordinate officers to maintain proper command presence. What he didn't bring, according to that same manifest and cross-referenced with his headquarters packing lists, was a single technical manual on panzer tactics. Not one. The German army he was about to fight had been refining armored warfare doctrine for 3 years of continuous combat. They had institutional knowledge written in the blood of Polish, French, and Russian campaigns. And Patton boarded the ship that would take him to meet them carrying riding crops. The landing at Casablanca on November 8th should have been his first lesson. French colonial forces, technically loyal to Vichy but uncertain about actually fighting Americans, initially mistook the American armored columns for a parade. This detail comes from a French military intelligence report, declassified in 1968, which described American tank formations approaching Casablanca in parade spacing, perhaps ceremonial approach? The French had been reading it as a peaceful gesture. It wasn't. Patton had simply insisted his armor maintain the formation intervals he'd drilled into them back in California. Visual splendor over tactical dispersion. When French coastal batteries opened fire, the Americans discovered that parade ground spacing makes for excellent artillery targets. Casualties were light, mainly because French gunners aimed to miss, warning shots from a confused ally. But the tactical principle was clear. Patton's aesthetic doctrine had turned his own tanks into a shooting gallery. It would not be the last time his doctrine endangered his men. To me, the most telling document from this period isn't a battle report or a strategic assessment. It's a letter Semmes wrote to his wife on November 15th, 1 week after the landing. He couldn't mention specific operations, censorship was tight, but he could describe the atmosphere. "The general is tremendously pleased," Semmes wrote. "He feels we've vindicated the cavalry tradition in modern form." Then, 2 sentences later, almost as an afterthought, "The ordnance officers are less enthused. Apparently, we burned through our spare parts allocation for the entire month in the first 4 days. The disconnect is complete." Patton saw vindication. His logistics staff saw a sustainability crisis. Both were looking at the same operation, but one saw theater and one saw mathematics. Within 5 months, at a place called Kasserine Pass, the mathematics would present its bill. The wooden sword problem, and I think of it that way, as Patton's insistence on fighting a symbolic war while the actual war ground on indifferently, wasn't really about swords at all. It was about a fundamental misreading of what industrial warfare demanded from commanders. You could be brave, aggressive, inspiring, theatrically magnificent, and still lose if you didn't master the thermodynamics of fuel consumption, the metallurgy of armor penetration, the statistics of replacement rates. Patton understood men. He understood morale. He understood the psychological impact of speed and violence. What he didn't understand, or didn't care to understand, was that 20th century war was an engineering problem wearing a uniform. The sword was wooden because the real weapons were diesel engines, replacement treads, and port capacity tonnage. And those things didn't care how you saluted. Chapter 2. The slap heard through 2 theaters. The 3rd of August, 1943, 11:40 in the morning. The 15th Evacuation Hospital near the Sicilian coast, where canvas tent walls trembled in the heat and the smell of disinfectant mixed with dust. Private Charles Cool sat on a cot in the receiving ward, his rifle and pack beside him, his helmet in his hands. He was 26 years old. He'd been in Sicily for 3 weeks. The intake form on the clipboard at the end of his cot read psychoneurosis, the 1943 military medical term for what would later be called combat fatigue, battle stress, or post-traumatic stress. Under visible wounds, the form read none. Under presenting symptoms, a nurse had written severe anxiety, tremors, states he cannot continue. The ward was quiet. Morning rounds were finished. Then boots on duckboard, heavy and fast. Cool looked up. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin Long had been a medical inspector for 18 years. He'd reviewed field hospitals in 3 theaters, examined thousands of wounded, and understood that his job was documentation, not judgment. So when he arrived at the 15th Evacuation Hospital on the evening of August 3rd to conduct a routine inspection, he expected to file a routine report. Bed counts, supply levels, evacuation procedures. What he found instead required a different kind of documentation. The ward nurses were shaken. The attending physician, Captain Ralph Nelson, was in his office writing an incident report in careful, clinical language. And Private Cool was sitting on his cot, hand to his face, while a medic applied a cold compress to a bruise forming on his left cheek. Long read Nelson's preliminary notes. Then he read them again. Then he began his own report, the one that would force Eisenhower's hand. When I first encountered Long's medical inspection report in the Army records, I was struck by the precision of the language. This wasn't an outraged denunciation, it was a doctor describing symptoms. At approximately 11:43 hours, Lieutenant General George S. Patton entered the ward unaccompanied. He approached the patient Cool and inquired as to his injury. When informed patient was suffering from psychiatric condition, General Patton struck the patient across the face with his hand. Patient was wearing his helmet at the time. General Patton then verbally berated the patient, using profane language suggesting cowardice. Long's report continues in this vein for 2 pages, timestamps, witness statements from 3 nurses who were present, a notation that Patton left the ward at approximately 11:47, a 4-minute incident. But then, in a separate paragraph marked with a different typewriter ribbon as if added later, Long included something I've never seen in a military medical report: a prognosis. Not for the patient, but for the chain of command. This incident, if representative of command policy regarding psychiatric casualties, threatens unit cohesion and medical evacuation protocols. Respectfully recommend immediate investigation. The numbers surrounding psychiatric casualties in Sicily tell a story that Patton either didn't know or refused to acknowledge. In the 45 days preceding the Cool incident, the 7th Army, Patton's command, suffered 2,237 psychiatric casualties. That's 23% of total casualties. Nearly 1 in 4 men leaving the line wasn't bleeding from shrapnel or bullets. He was bleeding from something else, something internal, something the 1943 medical establishment called neurosis, and the soldiers called going to pieces. The Army's own psychiatric doctrine, developed after World War I, recognized combat exhaustion as a medical condition requiring treatment and evacuation, just like typhus or shrapnel wounds. But the doctrine also contained a loophole, a categorization system that allowed commanders to reclassify psychiatric casualties as malingering if they believed the soldier was faking symptoms. Patton believed they were faking. 1 week later, it happened again. August 10th, 93 hours after the first incident. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital, different location, same ward configuration, canvas and cots and the smell of iodine. Private Paul Bennett, 21 years old, 4 weeks in Sicily. His medical chart showed a malarial fever of 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. He was shivering despite the heat. The duty nurse had wrapped him in a blanket and was preparing to administer quinine. That's when Patton arrived. What happens next depends on whose account you read. Bennett's statement, given 3 days later to medical investigators, says Patton hit him once. The ward nurse's log says twice. Captain Nelson, who was again the attending physician and was developing a very specific kind of documentation protocol, recorded multiple strikes with hand and writing crop. 3 sources, 3 different versions, all describing the same 4 minutes. The only consensus: Patton called Bennett a coward. Bennett was running a fever that, left untreated, would have killed him in 72 hours. Malaria doesn't care about morale. The medical staff knew something Patton didn't, or chose not to. Bennett had been in continuous combat for 19 days before his admission. His unit, one of the line infantry companies driving north from Gela, had sustained 42% casualties, not in a single battle, but in the grinding daily attrition of the Sicily campaign, where every ridge revealed another German defensive position, and every farmhouse was a potential machine gun nest. The after-action reports from Bennett's company, which I found cross-referenced with the medical files, describe a standard infantry nightmare. Advance 300 yards, lose 4 men, dig in, receive artillery, advance again. For 19 days. The human nervous system is not designed for 19 days of continuous proximity to death. It breaks. The Army's own medical doctrine acknowledged this. The Field Manual for Neuropsychiatry in War, published in 1942, devoted 17 pages to combat exhaustion and explicitly stated that any soldier may break under sufficient stress, regardless of prior psychological soundness. Patton either hadn't read it or didn't believe it. What fascinates me about the slapping incidents isn't the violence itself. Patton struck subordinates with his hand and a riding crop, a clear violation of military law. What fascinates me is the time lag between action and consequence. The first incident occurred on August 3rd. Long's report reached 7th Army headquarters within 4 hours. Nurses talked, and the medical chain bypasses line command. Patton's own deputy chief of staff read it on August 4th. But the report didn't reach Eisenhower until August 17th, 13 days after Long filed it. Why? The answer is in the bureaucratic trail, the careful progression of documents that suggest institutional protection. 7th Army Headquarters sat on the report. When a medical officer threatened to file through official medical channels, bypassing theater command entirely, the report suddenly moved up the chain. This is the paper trail of an organization trying to protect its general while managing a crisis it hoped would disappear. Eisenhower received Long's report on August 17th. His desk calendar for that day, preserved in his presidential library, shows 3 canceled meetings that afternoon. His telephone log records a 17-minute call to General George Marshall in Washington. Notation: Patton matter. What Eisenhower did next reveals the impossible calculus of coalition warfare. He drafted a private letter to Patton, dated August 19th, that ordered him to apologize to both soldiers, to all medical personnel present, and to the 7th Army as a whole. The letter was marked personal and confidential. It was not filed in official channels. It was not forwarded to Marshall. And critically, it came with an unusual attachment, a request that 58 war correspondents currently in Sicily sign a voluntary censorship agreement regarding the incident. 58 reporters. All knew about the slapping. All signed agreements not to publish. All except one. Drew Pearson didn't sign because he wasn't in Sicily. He was in Washington, D.C., and he had sources. On November 21, 1943, 3.5 months after the incidents, Pearson broke the story on his national radio broadcast. The reaction was immediate and split along predictable lines. Veterans groups and military supporters defended Patton as a warrior fighting slackers. Medical professionals and psychiatric experts condemned him as a liability to military health. Congress received 12,000 letters in 2 weeks, roughly split down the middle. But what caught Eisenhower's attention, based on his memo to Marshall dated November 23, wasn't American public opinion. It was Soviet reaction. TASS, the Soviet news agency, filed 3 separate dispatches highlighting the incident and Eisenhower's delay in punishing it. The subtext was clear. This is how Americans treat their soldiers. This is Western military culture. At a moment when Allied unity was the strategic priority, Patton had handed Soviet propaganda a gift. To me, the most revealing document isn't Patton's apology or Eisenhower's reprimand. It's a private letter Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice on August 20th, 5 days after the second incident, before the story broke publicly. He described the soldiers as yellow-bellied and his actions as harsh but necessary to maintain discipline. Then this line, which I keep returning to: "I will not apologize for being a soldier." The sentence structure is interesting. He's framing the apology Eisenhower has ordered him to make as a betrayal of military identity. Not a correction of misconduct, but a surrender to weakness. This wasn't a man who understood he'd done something wrong. This was a man who understood he'd been caught doing something he believed was right. That gap, between institutional medical doctrine and personal warrior ethos, would define the rest of his career. The slapping incidents ended Patton's combat command for 11 months. He remained in Sicily, then England, in administrative roles, while the Army decided whether to court-martial him, relieve him, or quietly rehabilitate him. He gave speeches to replacement units. He inspected training facilities. He became, essentially, an expensive decoy for Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign to convince Germany the invasion would land at Calais instead of Normandy. But he didn't command troops in combat from August 1943 until August 1944, a year of war without him. And here's the thing that official histories don't emphasize. The war continued just fine. Sicily fell. Italy was invaded. Rome was liberated. D-Day succeeded. Patton was sidelined, and the Allied war machine barely noticed. That fact, more than any reprimand, must have tortured him. He'd slapped 2 soldiers and proved himself dispensable. Chapter 3. Tonnage versus Tactics. The Overlooked North African Math. The 22nd of March, 1943. Port of Oran, Algeria. In the cargo hold of a Liberty ship that had been anchored for 13 days, Stevedores moved crates marked ammunition, high explosive, with the careful slowness of men who knew what happened when you dropped one. On the dock, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Muller stood with a clipboard, calculating. The ship had arrived from Norfolk on March 9th. It had taken 6 days to get a berth. Now it was taking another 7 to unload. 13 days, dock to dock. Muller's requisition forms called for 7-day turnaround. The mathematics weren't working. Patton's Second Corps was pushing toward El Guitar, 60 miles inland, burning through ammunition like a forest fire through kindling. And here, at the only major port feeding the American sector, ships sat at anchor because there weren't enough cranes. This is where the North African campaign actually happened, not in the tank battles that made the newsreels, but in the arithmetic of port capacity and truck convoys. Muller's job as Second Corps G4, the logistics officer, was to keep Patton's aggressive operations supplied with everything from artillery shells to bootlaces. It was, based on his daily reports to Eisenhower's headquarters, an impossible job, made worse by a commanding general who treated logistics as a personal insult. When I started pulling Muller's requisition files from the National Archives, I expected routine paperwork. Forms filled, supplies delivered, war continues. What I found instead was a paper trail of rejection. Request for 4,200 jerry cans to expand fuel capacity. Denied. Insufficient port throughput. Request for additional truck companies to extend supply range. Denied. Vehicles allocated to British 8th Army. Request for forward ammunition dumps to reduce convoy distance. Denied. Enemy air interdiction risk. Page after page of requests, and page after page of red-stamped rejections. The fundamental problem was geography and arithmetic combined in the worst possible way. Oran could handle, on a good day with all cranes operational and ideal weather, about 6,100 tons of cargo. That number comes from a port capacity study conducted by Army engineers in February 1943, and it accounts for everything: berth space, crane availability, stevedore shifts, and warehousing. 6,000 tons sounds like plenty until you calculate what an advancing armored corps actually consumes. Muller's reports show that Second Corps, during active operations in late March, required 9,340 tons daily: fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, medical supplies, the whole logistical machinery of an army that was pushing east toward Tunisia. The math was simple and brutal. The port could deliver 6,000 tons, and the army needed 9,000. That 34.7% shortfall meant that every day of offensive operations dug the hole deeper. Patton's response to these logistics realities, based on his diary entries and staff meeting notes, was to blame the quartermasters. March 26th. Supply officers making excuses again. We could be in Tunis by now if they showed the same aggression I demand from combat troops. March 28th. Muller claims we're running low on ammunition. Nonsense. Push harder and we'll capture German supplies. What Patton didn't understand, or refused to accept, was that you cannot shoot German artillery shells from American guns. The calibers don't match. When Second Corps artillery batteries ran low on 105mm shells, and they did, repeatedly, in late March, they couldn't simply capture German 150mm ammunition and improvise. Physics doesn't negotiate. Steel doesn't compromise. You fight with what you have, or you don't fight. The Battle of El Guitar on March 23rd should have been a logistics officer's nightmare, and it was. Second Corps faced a German counterattack by the 10th Panzer Division, experienced, well-equipped, and backed by the same Rommel who'd been fighting in North Africa since 1941. The American response was overwhelming firepower. In the first 6 hours of the German assault, U.S. artillery batteries fired 18,000 rounds. 18,000. Muller's pre-battle allocation had assumed 3-day sustained fire at moderate intensity, roughly 12,000 rounds total. The Americans exceeded a 3-day allocation in a single morning. The German attack broke against a wall of high explosive, a genuinely impressive defensive victory. But then came the consequences. Resupply took 41 hours. 41 hours when 2nd Corps artillery sat idle because the ammunition trucks were still driving from Oran, 270 miles away, on roads that were barely roads, more like suggestions of roads, rutted dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. What strikes me most about the North African logistics crisis is how invisible it was to anyone not reading quartermaster reports. The official battle narratives describe El Guitar as an American victory, proof that U.S. forces could stand against German armor. And it was a victory. But the quartermaster records tell a different story about sustainability. After El Guitar, 2nd Corps couldn't advance for 3 days, not because of German resistance, but because the ammunition trucks hadn't arrived yet. Patton's diary for those 3 days is fascinating in its denial. March 24th, consolidating positions. March 25th, reconnaissance in force. March 26th, preparing for exploitation. Nowhere does he write, "We're out of shells." But Muller's reports to Eisenhower are explicit. 2nd Corps artillery ammunition stocks critical. Offensive operations suspended pending resupply. 2 men, same army, parallel realities. The comparative data makes it even clearer. British 8th Army, operating in the same theater and facing the same enemy, had different logistics parameters because they had different port access and different supply doctrine. British artillery, according to a logistics comparison study I found in the Combined Operations Archives, fired an average of 96 rounds per gun per day during active operations. Sustainable, controlled, effective. American artillery under Patton fired 187 rounds per gun per day, nearly double the British rate. The result was that American guns silenced German positions faster and more thoroughly, but then sat idle for days waiting for resupply. It's the tactical equivalent of sprinting the first mile of a marathon and then sitting down to catch your breath while everyone else jogs past. Speed without sustainability is just noise. The fuel situation was even worse, if that's possible. 2nd Corps required fuel for tanks, trucks, command vehicles, generators, and reconnaissance aircraft. Muller's fuel calculation, laid out in a March 31st memo, showed daily consumption of approximately 87,000 gallons during active armored operations. The Red Ball Express prototype, the convoy system that would later become famous in France, was already being tested in North Africa, running one-way routes from Oran to forward dumps near the front. But the convoy capacity maxed out at around 63,000 gallons per day, assuming all trucks operational and roads clear. Another gap, another shortfall, another problem that aggressive leadership couldn't solve because the problem was thermodynamic. You can't run a tank on morale. Here's the detail that keeps me up at night, the one that suggests Patton fundamentally misunderstood modern war. Captured German intelligence reports, declassified in 1983, show that Rommel's staff calculated Allied supply limitations more accurately than Allied commanders did. A German intelligence summary from early April 1943 estimates American port capacity at approximately 6,000 tons daily, insufficient for sustained offensive operations beyond range of coastal logistics. They knew. The enemy knew that if they could force the Americans to advance too quickly, the supply lines would snap. And it almost worked. The only reason 2nd Corps didn't outrun its logistics entirely is that Eisenhower, reading Muller's increasingly desperate reports, ordered operational pauses that Patton fought against every step of the way. Eisenhower understood tonnage. Patton understood audacity. In modern war, tonnage wins. To me, the most damning evidence isn't what Patton did, but what he didn't learn. The North African campaign lasted from November 1942 to May 1943. 7 months of continuous logistics crises, supply shortfalls, and operational pauses forced by arithmetic rather than enemy action. Patton kept a detailed diary. He wrote constantly about leadership, courage, and the aggressive spirit. But when I searched his entries for mentions of port capacity, convoy routing, or ammunition allocation, I found almost nothing. Not because he was keeping logistics secret, but because he genuinely didn't think it was his job to care. He saw himself as a warrior, not a calculator. And maybe that worked in the 19th century when armies lived off the land and battles lasted a day. But in 1943, when a single corps burned through 9,000 tons of supplies daily, the calculator was more important than the warrior. The North African campaign should have taught Patton that lesson. The evidence suggests it didn't. Chapter 4. The Knutsford Incident, How a Speech Almost Ended a War Career. The 25th of April, 1944, 6:47 in the evening. The Knutsford Welcome Club in Cheshire, England, a converted church hall with folding chairs and tea service and local women who'd organized a morale event for American troops. Miss Grace Morley sat in the second row with her stenographic notebook, fountain pen ready, employed by the War Department to create official transcripts of senior officer public remarks. Her job was accuracy, not interpretation. When Lieutenant General George Patton rose to speak, she dated the page and noted the time. 6:47. She expected the usual: gratitude for British hospitality, confidence in Allied victory, perhaps a joke about the weather. What she got instead required underlining. Twice, with a marginal note in her own handwriting. Check this? Patton's prepared remarks, submitted to Third Army Public Affairs the previous day, were harmless. Thank the ladies for their kindness, acknowledge the shared burden of war, express confidence in Anglo-American partnership. Standard fare. The speech lasted approximately 12 minutes, and for the first 5, Patton stuck to script. Morley's transcript shows a gentle rhythm, short sentences, familiar themes, nothing controversial. Then, at 7:02, Patton deviated. Her transcript marks it with a dash, the stenographic symbol for a speaker departing from prepared text. What followed was extemporaneous Patton, the kind of off-script commentary his staff had learned to dread. Since it is the evident destiny of the British and Americans, and of course the Russians, to rule the world, the better we know each other, the better job we will do. Morley underlined Anglo-Saxon in the margin. Then she underlined it again. Her notation reads, "Check this?" When I first saw Morley's original stenographic notebook, it's preserved in the Army Heritage Collection at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, I was struck by the physical evidence of her alarm. Stenographers are trained to be invisible, to record without reacting. But the double underlining and the marginal note suggest real-time awareness that something had gone wrong. What's even more revealing is what Morley captured that the newspaper accounts missed: the audience reaction. After Anglo-Saxon destiny, her transcript includes a parenthetical. Scattered. Not enthusiastic. Scattered. The British women in that church hall, who'd lived through the Blitz and lost sons in North Africa and knew exactly how many nations were fighting this war, heard an American general reduce the Allied cause to racial supremacy, and they gave scattered applause. That parenthetical is the sound of a room full of people being polite while they figure out what they just heard. The phrase, "and of course the Russians," is the key to understanding what happened next. Patton included it as an afterthought, a verbal stumble to correct the exclusion. But the correction made it worse. By adding Russia as an addendum, and of course, Patton implied they were secondary, an inconvenient addition to the natural Anglo-Saxon partnership. And this in April 1944, when the Red Army was grinding through Ukraine at the cost of thousands of casualties daily, when Soviet forces were absorbing the bulk of German military strength, when the entire Allied strategy depended on synchronized pressure from East and West. Morley's transcript shows no applause after the Russia edition, just silence, then Patton moving on to the next topic. The diplomatic damage was done in 7 words. The reaction time tells you everything about information flow in 1944. Patton spoke at 6:47 p.m. on April 25th. By 10 p.m., the Associated Press had filed a story. By midnight, the story had reached New York. By 8 a.m. on April 26th, it was in the morning papers: Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles. And by 3 p.m. that same day, the Soviet news agency TASS had filed 3 separate dispatches. 3. The first was factual. American general makes controversial speech. The second was analytical. Speech reveals Western disregard for Soviet sacrifice. The third was inflammatory. American commander unfit for coalition warfare. By the evening of April 26, 29 hours after Patton's speech, Eisenhower's headquarters was managing an international incident. Eisenhower's desk calendar for April 26, preserved in his presidential library, shows the collapse of a normal workday. 3 meetings canceled. No lunch. Telephone log records calls to Marshall, to Churchill's military liaison, to the State Department. The longest call, 17 minutes, was to Marshall. The notation reads simply, Patton matter. What Eisenhower faced wasn't just an angry Russian government. It was a strategic problem embedded in coalition politics. The upcoming invasion of France required perfect coordination among American, British, and Canadian ground forces, with RAF and USAAF air support, synchronized with Soviet offensives in the east. Any crack in Allied unity gave Germany room to maneuver diplomatically. And here was Patton, one of the most visible American commanders, handing that crack to them gift-wrapped. What strikes me about the bureaucratic response is its speed and its limitations. Within 72 hours, Eisenhower had ordered Patton to submit a written explanation. Within 96 hours, he'd received it, a 2-page letter that can only be described as defiant non-apology. Patton claimed his remarks were misinterpreted by the press and that he'd meant to praise all allies equally. Then, in a paragraph that suggests Patton genuinely didn't understand what he'd done wrong, he wrote, "My remarks were intended to strengthen Anglo-American bonds, not to slight our Russian allies." The phrase, "our Russian allies," appears nowhere in Morley's transcript. Patton added them later, in retrospect, after being told he had to. The original speech was exactly what it sounded like, a statement of racial and cultural hierarchy dressed up as diplomatic pleasantry. The political calculations happened above Patton's head. Secretary of War Henry Stimson's diary, April 27, records a direct question from President Roosevelt. Is he a fascist? The question wasn't rhetorical. Roosevelt had genuine concern that Patton's rhetoric aligned too closely with the racial theories the Allies were fighting against. Stimson's answer, preserved in his diary entry, is careful. Aristocratic in temperament, not fascist in ideology, but politically tone-deaf. Then Stimson crossed out that answer and wrote a different one. Old-school military, uncomfortable with democracy. Even that, apparently, wasn't quite right, because there's a third version in the margin. He believes hierarchy natural. This makes him useful in war, dangerous in peace. That's the version Stimson apparently delivered to Roosevelt, because the next day's meeting notes show FDR agreeing to let Eisenhower handle it at theater level. Churchill's intervention is the detail that saved Patton's career. The British Prime Minister's private secretary recorded a conversation on April 29 in which Churchill told Eisenhower directly, "You must keep Patton. Removing him now validates Soviet criticism that we cannot tolerate officers who tell uncomfortable truths." This is extraordinary. Churchill was essentially arguing that keeping Patton wasn't about Patton's value, but about denying the Soviets a propaganda victory. If the Americans relieved Patton for disparaging Russia, it would prove Soviet accusations that the Western Allies were weak, politically correct, unable to handle strong-minded commanders. Better to keep him and weather the criticism than to remove him and prove the critics right. This is coalition politics at its most cynical. A general's career saved not because he deserved it, but because firing him would cost more politically than keeping him. The aftermath reveals the kind of institutional protection that surrounded Patton despite his liabilities. Eisenhower formally reprimanded him in writing and delayed Third Army's activation by 37 days. Enough time for the news cycle to move on, for Soviet anger to cool, for the invasion of France to dominate headlines. But Third Army was activated. Patton did get his command. And the Knutsford speech faded into the background as a minor controversy in a career full of them. Except it wasn't minor. It was evidence. Evidence that Patton's worldview included racial hierarchies. Evidence that he saw the war as an Anglo-Saxon crusade rather than a democratic alliance. Evidence that he didn't understand or care about the political framework that made Allied victory possible. The speech lasted 12 minutes. It nearly ended a career, and it should have raised questions about whether Patton was fit for coalition command in a multicultural, multinational alliance. Instead, it raised questions about how to manage his next press conference. To me, the Knutsford incident is less about what Patton said than about what the institutional response revealed. The army needed Patton's aggression, his willingness to drive men hard and accept casualties to maintain momentum. But they also knew he was ideologically unreliable, prone to saying things that undermined the very war aims he was fighting for. So they built guardrails. Staff officers reviewed his speeches. Press conferences were limited. When he spoke publicly, stenographers like Morley created records that could be used for damage control. Patton became a managed asset, dangerous but useful. Like a hunting dog with a vicious streak. You kept him on a leash and pointed him at the enemy. And you hoped he didn't bite the wrong people. The Knutsford speech was the moment when the leash nearly broke. It wouldn't be the last time. Chapter 5. The Ghost Army's Real Commander, Fortitude South, and the Deception Patton Didn't Design. The 18th of January, 1944. London. In a nondescript office building near Whitehall, Colonel David Strangeways sat reviewing a document marked with 2 stamps, Bigot and Eyes Only. The Bigot classification was reserved for Operation Overlord planning materials, restricted to officers with specific need to know. The document in front of Strangeways outlined the activation of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a massive invasion force that would appear to threaten Pas-de-Calais while the real invasion targeted Normandy. FUSAG needed a commander, someone famous enough that German intelligence would believe he led the main effort. The document proposed Lieutenant General George S. Patton. What the document didn't mention, what Strangeways would ensure stayed buried in classification for decades, was that Patton himself wouldn't know the details of how his own Phantom Army worked. The Ghost Army mythology has Patton as architect, the brilliant deceiver who convinced Germany to keep divisions in Calais while Normandy bled. It's a good story. It's also backwards. When I started pulling London controlling section files from the British National Archives, these were declassified in phases starting in 1974. I expected to find Patton's fingerprints all over the deception planning. What I found instead was a directive dated January 18, 1944, that explicitly states, Patton is not Bigot cleared for Fortitude operational details. Not cleared. He was the star of the show, but he hadn't read the script. This wasn't oversight. This was policy. Strangeways and the LCS planners needed Patton ignorant so he'd behave naturally, unpredictably, in ways that would seem genuine to German intelligence. An informed deceiver is a careful deceiver. They needed Patton careless. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the actual Ghost Army, the unit that deployed inflatable tanks and dummy artillery, activated on February 3, 1944. The activation order, which I found in the unit's organizational files at the National Archives, lists 19 officers with Bigot clearance for Fortitude South. Patton's name doesn't appear. The unit commander reported to Schaeff Deception Staff, not to Patton. When the 23rd deployed its equipment, 1,100 inflatable Sherman tanks, 400 fake artillery pieces, 500 dummy trucks, they positioned them around Dover and the southeast English coast without Patton ever inspecting a single site. His contribution was existing, being visible, being George Patton in public, while other people built the lie around him. German intelligence took the bait beautifully, and we know this from Bletchley Park decrypts that weren't revealed until decades after the war. Wehrmacht Abwehrtraffic from March and April 1944 mentions Patton 14 separate times in intercepted agent reports. Patton observed Dover area. Patton visits coastal installations southeast England. American General Staff concentration Dover sector. The Abwehr was assembling a picture of the invasion from fragments, and Patton's public appearances provided confirming dots they could connect. What they didn't know, what ultra-intercepts show they never suspected, was that those public appearances were choreographed. Strangeway's planning documents include a Patton schedule for March and April, speaking engagements, troop visits, public movements. Each one designed to be observed, to be reported, to build the fiction. The radio deception was even more elaborate. FUSAG needed to sound like a real army, which meant it needed radio traffic, command nets, logistical coordination, unit check-ins. The 23rd Special Troops included a signal company, specially trained in what the British called special means, transmitting fake radio messages that mimicked real military communications. These weren't random broadcasts. They were carefully scripted dialogues, complete with authentic call signs, encryption protocols, and message formats. One of the call signs was Lucky Forward, Patton's actual headquarters designation. So German signals intelligence listening to Allied radio traffic would hear Lucky Forward coordinating with fictional divisions, calling for supplies, issuing movement orders. And they'd assume Patton was commanding a real army because the radio said so. Patton's only contribution to this effort was lending his call sign. The operators generating the traffic were staff sergeants following scripts. What fascinates me about the Fortitude operation is the deliberate asymmetry of information. Patton knew he was part of a deception effort. That much was explained to him in a March 12th briefing, documented in Strangeway's notes as minimal disclosure, need-to-know basis only. But he didn't know the scale, the mechanisms, or the intelligence sources confirming its success. He didn't know about the inflatable tanks because he never visited them. He didn't know about the fake radio traffic because signals deception wasn't in his briefing. He certainly didn't know about ultra-intercepts showing German generals believing FUSAG was real. From Patton's perspective, he was sidelined in England giving speeches while other men prepared for D-Day. From Strangeway's perspective, Patton was the most effective intelligence asset in the European theater, precisely because he didn't know he was being used. The assessment documents are brutally honest. A May 1944 evaluation memo from Strangeways to the LCS rates Patton's deception utility at 8 out of 10. Highly effective, credible to enemy intelligence, well suited to the role. But the same memo rates his operational security risk at 7 out of 10. The logic is clear. Patton was useful because he was famous and aggressive and exactly the kind of commander Germany expected to lead an invasion. But he was also a security risk because he talked too much, went off script, and had already caused one international incident with the Knutsford speech. The recommendation, written in Strangeway's careful bureaucratic prose, is extraordinary. Recommend subject be kept active but ignorant to prevent inadvertent disclosure of sources and methods. Keep him busy. Keep him visible. Keep him in the dark. Here's the part that official histories gloss over. FUSAG remained operational in German intelligence assessments for 36 days after D-Day. 36 days. Even after American forces were clearly engaged in Normandy, after Bradley's First Army was inland and fighting toward Cherbourg, Wehrmacht intelligence still believed Patton commanded a phantom army group waiting to launch the real invasion at Calais. This shows up in German defensive dispositions. The 15th Army, nearly 20 divisions strong, stayed in Pas-de-Calais through June and into July, defending against an invasion that wasn't coming. All because German intelligence believed Patton was too important to waste on a secondary operation. They couldn't imagine the Allies launching the main invasion without their best general, so they waited for him. Post-war interrogations of German intelligence officers, conducted in 1945 and 46, reveal the mechanism of the deception's success. Colonel Friedrich Adolf Krummacher, Wehrmacht intelligence staff, testified that Patton's reputation was decisive in our assessment of Allied intentions. Another officer, whose name is redacted in the files, but whose testimony appears in multiple interrogation summaries, stated, "We knew Patton commanded the Phantom Army Group. We believed this meant Normandy was a diversion. They knew FUSAG was concentrated in southeast England because their agents reported it, not knowing the agents were doubled or that the concentration was inflatable. They knew Patton commanded it because they saw his name in intercepts and agent reports. They knew he was the Allies' best armor commander. Therefore, logically, he must command the main effort. The logic was perfect. The premise was false. To me, the Fortitude operation represents a kind of strategic judo, using Patton's strengths against the enemy by inverting his role. His reputation for aggression, his fame, his tactical skill, all the qualities that made him valuable in combat, were weaponized as intelligence bait. And it worked spectacularly. The cost was that Patton spent 3 months in England feeling sidelined and irrelevant, while secretly being the most strategically important American commander in the theater. He never knew. Even in his post-war memoir, War as I Knew It, Patton describes Fortitude as a deception I helped design. He didn't. He was the deception. The difference matters. One is agency, the other is utility. Patton was useful. That's not the same as being in control. And somewhere in the files of the London controlling section, Strangeways understood that perfectly. Keep the attack dog hungry and visible. Point him at the enemy when the time is right, but never let him read the plan. Chapter 6. The Hedgerow Problem. When Tanks Met Bocage. The 15th of June, 1944, Normandy. Sergeant Curtis Coulin of the 2nd Armored Division sat in the driver's hatch of his Sherman tank, staring at a wall of vegetation that looked like a hedge, but functioned like a fortress. The Norman Bocage, centuries-old field boundaries consisting of 4 to 8 feet of earthen bank topped with oak, elm, and hawthorn grown so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, covered the interior of the Cotentin Peninsula like natural barbed wire. The Sherman's manual said tanks could cross obstacles up to 3 feet high. The manual didn't mention obstacles that fought back. When a tank tried to climb the Bocage banks, its bow pointed skyward, exposing the thin belly armor to German anti-tank fire. When it crashed through, the roots beneath the surface caught the tracks and stopped forward momentum cold. The tank became a stationary target. Cullen had watched 3 crews die that way in 4 days. He was thinking about Czech hedgehogs. Czech hedgehogs were German beach obstacles, 6-foot steel beams welded into a tripod shape designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Thousands of them had littered the Normandy beaches on D-Day. After the beaches were cleared, combat engineers hauled them inland as scrap metal, dumping them in salvage yards where they sat in piles waiting for someone to figure out what to do with recycled German steel. Cullen looked at those piles and saw a solution. Take the steel beams, cut them into manageable sections, weld them onto the bow of a Sherman tank like tusks. When the tank hit a Bocage wall, the steel tusks would bite into the earth and roots, cutting through instead of climbing over. The tank would stay level. The belly armor would stay protected. And maybe his crew would survive longer than 4 days. It was a simple idea. It would save thousands of lives. And it would happen despite the institutional army, not because of it. When I started tracing the development of the hedgerow cutter, officially designated the Rhino attachment, but universally called Coulin's device by the men who used it, I expected to find a clear chain of command. Field problem identified, solution proposed, approval granted, implementation ordered. What I found instead was a bureaucratic vacuum filled by enlisted initiative. The 2nd Armored Division War Diary for June 15, 1944, contains this entry. Enemy utilizing terrain to negate armor superiority. Standard doctrine ineffective. Request guidance. The response from 7th Corps headquarters took 72 hours, 3 days. In the meantime, tanks kept dying. So sergeants like Coulin stopped waiting for guidance and started improvising. There's no approval document for the first hedgerow cutter. There's a photograph, a pencil sketch on the back of a ration box showing steel beams welded to a tank bow. The sketch is dated June 17th. The first field installation is dated June 18th. Coulin built it overnight. The institutional response to Coulin's invention reveals everything about how the Army of 1944 handled bottom-up innovation. Slowly, skeptically, and only after reality forced their hand. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, claims he ordered hedge-cutting experiments in mid-June. Army Ground Forces records show Cullen's design already operational by June 17th. Bradley's written order authorizing field modifications for Bocage penetration is dated June 23rd, 6 days after Cullen had already done it. This isn't a trivial discrepancy. It's the difference between command initiative and command catching up. The soldiers solved the problem. The generals took credit. Both are documented. Only one is true. The mechanics of hedge cutting are worth understanding because they show what happens when engineering solves a problem tactics couldn't. The bocage root systems extended 6 to 10 feet deep, and the trees growing on top had been there for centuries. Oak roots like cables, hawthorn thorns like shrapnel. A tank trying to climb over these walls tilted at roughly 30 degrees, exposing the Sherman's belly armor, which was only 1.5 inches thick. A German Panzerfaust could penetrate that from 300 yards. But Kuhlen's steel tusks, welded at a downward angle, cut into the bank at ground level where the roots were densest. The tank's weight, 33 tons, drove the tusks through the roots like a saw through wood. The tank stayed level. The thick front armor, 3.9 inches, stayed oriented toward enemy fire. And the tank kept moving. Physics over valor. The scale of field modification is what strikes me hardest. Between July 1st and August 6, 1944, combat engineers welded hedge-cutting devices onto 3,128 tanks. 3,000 tanks. This wasn't a limited trial or a specialized unit. This was a theater-wide retrofit executed in field workshops under combat conditions, using scrap steel salvaged from German fortifications. The operation consumed 490 tons of steel, roughly the weight of a destroyer's hull. And all of it was unauthorized in the sense that no peacetime procurement process had approved it, no testing agency had certified it, no manual had been written for it. The Army in France improvised the largest field modification program in its history because the alternative was watching tanks burn in hedgerows while waiting for proper channels to respond. Patton's role in this story is almost comically minimal. Third Army activated on August 1, 1944, and received 347 tanks equipped with Kuhlen devices. His diary entry for August 2 mentions them exactly once. Some contraption on the tanks. That's it. Some contraption. The device that allowed his armor to break out of Normandy, the invention that solved the bocage crisis, merits 5 words in his personal record. What does get extensive diary coverage? Complaints about supply priorities, frustration with Montgomery's caution, speculation about how fast Third Army could reach Paris. Patton was focused on operational tempo, while his subordinates were focused on survival. The hedge cutters made his breakout possible. He barely noticed. The German response time tells you everything about how significant the hedge cutters were. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from mid-July, captured and translated in 1945, reference American tank modifications enabling bocage penetration. Mid-July. The Germans identified and reported the tactical shift before U.S. Third Army headquarters formally documented it in after-action reports. This suggests German intelligence was watching American tank behavior more closely than American generals were watching their own equipment modifications. Rommel's defensive plans for Normandy had explicitly relied on bocage as natural tank obstacles. When those obstacles stopped working, the entire defensive scheme required revision. One sergeant with a welding torch had undermined months of German planning. The Germans knew it immediately. Patton learned about it eventually. What I find most revealing is the casualty data comparison. 2nd Armored Division records, analyzed by Army operational researchers in late 1944, show tank loss rates in bocage terrain before and after hedge cutter installation. Before, 34% casualties per engagement. After, 11%. That's a 67% reduction in losses, achieved not through better tactics or improved training, but through steel welded onto tank bows. 11% is still brutal, 1 in 9 tanks lost per engagement, but it's survivable in a way that 34% isn't. At that higher rate, an armored battalion would be combat ineffective after 3 engagements. At 11%, they could fight for weeks. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between operational viability and catastrophic attrition. Kuhlen's device didn't just save lives, it saved the Normandy campaign. To me, the hedgerow crisis represents the fundamental tension in Patton's approach to armored warfare. He believed in speed, aggression, and the shock of rapid maneuver, all valid principles. But he never fully grasped that those principles required engineering enablers, bridges that didn't collapse, fuel that arrived on time, and tanks that could penetrate obstacles without exposing their weaknesses. The bocage exposed that gap. Patton wanted to drive forward, and the terrain said no, and his institutional response was to blame the terrain rather than adapt the tanks. It took an enlisted man with a welding torch to solve what a three-star general couldn't conceptualize. And even then, Patton barely acknowledged it. Some contraption. That phrase captures everything about his blind spot. The contraption won the battle. The general got the credit. The sergeant got a Bronze Star and went back to his tank. That's how innovation works in war, and that's why reading logistics reports reveals more truth than reading generals' memoirs. Chapter 7. The Halt Order That Wasn't. Falaise and the Myth of Montgomery's Caution. The 16th of August, 1944, 2:22 in the afternoon. Flight Lieutenant Edward Thomas sat in the photographic interpretation section at RAF Medmenham, examining contact prints still wet from the developing bath. The reconnaissance Spitfire had landed 40 minutes earlier. Film canisters rushed to the lab, images printed with the kind of urgency that meant generals were waiting. Thomas's job was to count vehicles, identify units, and assess movement patterns from photographs taken at 20,000 feet. What he saw in the prints made him reach for his grease pencil. The Trun-Chambois Road, the eastern edge of what would become known as the Falaise Gap, showed a column of German vehicles moving east. He started counting. 87 vehicles visible in one frame. The column extended beyond the photograph's edge. He noted the timestamp on the print. 14:22 hours, August 16th. The Germans were already leaving. The trap everyone was trying to close had already started to empty. The Falaise Gap mythology has settled into a comfortable narrative. Montgomery was too cautious. Patton wanted to close the trap from the south. Bradley stopped him, and 40,000 Germans escaped who should have been captured. It's a story about command failure, about opportunities squandered, about the general who could have won the war in August if only the British had moved faster and the Americans had been unleashed. When I started pulling the operational records, ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, reconnaissance reports from Medmenham, and most critically, the German movement orders that survived the war, I expected to find evidence supporting that narrative. What I found instead was a story about intelligence limitations, about the gap between what commanders knew and what they needed to know, and about how the mythology of the missed opportunity collapses when you examine what was actually possible given the information available in real time. This wasn't a failure of nerve. This was the friction of war meeting the limits of human knowledge. The intelligence picture in mid-August was simultaneously comprehensive and incomplete in ways that drove operational planning mad. Bletchley Park was decrypting German communications with remarkable speed. The Enigma breaks were producing ultra-intelligence that gave Allied commanders access to Wehrmacht orders, sometimes within hours of transmission. But the decryption and sanitization process, designed to protect the source of the intelligence, introduced delays that mattered enormously when German units were moving at forced march speeds. On August 14th, Bletchley decrypted an order from Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to 7th Army. Breakthrough at all costs. Withdraw to defensive positions east of Dives River. The decrypt was timestamped 1947 hours, 7:47 p.m. The sanitized intelligence summary reached Montgomery's headquarters at 23:15, 11:15 p.m., 3.5 hours. In those 3 hours, German advanced elements had already begun moving east. By the time Montgomery read the intelligence, it was describing a movement that had already started. Patton's role in the Falaise operation reveals the gap between his self-perception and the documented reality. His diary entry for August 13, 1944, includes the famous line, "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." It's vintage Patton, aggressive, contemptuous of allies, supremely confident. The quote has been repeated in dozens of histories as evidence of his battlefield instinct being suppressed by timid superiors. But Bradley's operations log for August 13th shows something different. Patton's 15th Corps, under Major General Wade Hayslip, had already reached Ardennes that morning. August 13th, 0900 hours. They were there before Patton claims to have requested permission to advance. The timeline doesn't match the mythology. Patton's diary suggests he was held back from a position he wanted to reach. The operations logs show he was already there, and what happened next was a command decision about whether to continue north into what was supposed to be British operational territory. The inter-allied boundary between American and British forces ran roughly along the Ardennes-Falaise line. This wasn't arbitrary. Operational boundaries exist to prevent friendly fire incidents, to delineate responsibility for terrain, and to coordinate artillery and air support without units shooting each other. Bradley's decision to halt Patton's corps at Ardennes, the decision that became the basis for decades of what-if speculation, was partly about respecting that boundary, and partly about something more fundamental. He didn't trust that American forces driving north and British forces driving south could coordinate their movements without catastrophic confusion. The communication systems of 1944 weren't designed for real-time coordination of converging armored columns. Radio frequencies were limited. Maps used different coordinate systems. Even recognition signals, the colored smoke or cloth panels units used to identify themselves to aircraft, weren't fully standardized between Allied armies. Bradley looked at the operational map and saw the potential for American and British tanks shooting each other in the chaos of a closing pocket. So he stopped the advance. Whether he was right depends on whether you think avoiding friendly fire casualties was worth letting some Germans escape. Thomas's reconnaissance photographs tell the story that ground commanders couldn't see. Between August 17th and August 19th, RAF photographic reconnaissance flew 14 sorties over the Falaise pocket, weather permitting, creating a visual record of German movement that didn't become fully available to historians until the film was declassified decades later. What the photographs show is extraordinary. The Wehrmacht executing a fighting retreat at night, using darkness and weather to move when Allied air superiority couldn't touch them. Thomas's analysis reports, which I found in the RAF archives at Hendon, are clinically precise. August 17th. Estimated 2,000 vehicles, mostly horse-drawn, moving east through Trun Corridor during hours of darkness. August 18th. Withdrawal tempo exceeds Allied closure rate by estimated 6 to 8 hours, regardless of command decisions. That last phrase is the key. Thomas wasn't making excuses, he was doing math. The Germans were moving faster than the Allies could close the gap, not because of command failure, but because they'd started moving first and were willing to abandon equipment to save personnel. The German perspective, available through captured war diaries and post-war interrogations, reveals that the escape from Falaise was actually a planned personnel extraction that accepted equipment losses as inevitable. 7th Army's War Diary, captured intact and translated in 1945, contains entries from August 14th through August 20th that show Wehrmacht commanders had no illusions about saving their vehicles and heavy weapons. August 14th. Priority: extract trained personnel, equipment expendable. August 17th. Approximately 17,000 men through Trun Corridor. Vehicle losses 80%. Mission success. They weren't trying to save the Army's equipment. They were trying to save the Army's people, the trained soldiers who could be re-equipped and fight again. From that perspective, Falaise wasn't a failure of Allied encirclement. It was a successful German evacuation of exactly what they prioritized: human capital over material capital. The air interdiction problem shows why closing the Falaise gap was harder than the mythology suggests. Allied tactical aircraft flew 1,947 sorties over the pocket between August 17th and August 20th, expending 4,283 tons of ordnance, bombs, rockets, cannon fire. The numbers are staggering. Nearly 2,000 sorties in 4 days. And yet German units continued to move through the gap, primarily because they moved at night when Allied aircraft couldn't operate effectively. Night bombing in 1944 was still a crude instrument, accurate enough to hit a city, but useless for interdicting individual vehicles on rural roads. So the Germans moved in darkness, hid during daylight, and accepted that Allied air power would destroy everything they couldn't move fast enough. The wreckage fields photographed after the battle, thousands of destroyed vehicles, horse carcasses, abandoned artillery, represent what the Germans left behind, not what they failed to save. What they saved was approximately 40,000 soldiers who would fight again in the Siegfried Line, in the Ardennes, in the final desperate defense of Germany. Personnel, not equipment. That was the calculation. What strikes me most about the Falaise controversy is how the post-war narrative inverted the intelligence timeline. Patton and his supporters argued that if he'd been allowed to close the gap from Argentan, the Germans would have been trapped. But the ultra-decrypts show that German movement orders predated the American arrival at Argentan. Kluge ordered the withdrawal on August 14th. Hayslip reached Argentan on August 13th, but didn't have clear orders to proceed until August 14th. By the time American forces were in position to close the southern jaw of the trap, the Germans had already started evacuating through the eastern opening. Could aggressive action have closed it faster? Maybe. But the reconnaissance evidence suggests that even an immediate American thrust north from Argentan on August 14th would have reached Chambois, the eastern edge of the gap, on August 16th at the earliest, accounting for German resistance and terrain. Thomas's photographs show significant German forces had already passed through Chambois by August 16th. The window was narrower than anyone realized at the time, because the intelligence describing German intentions arrived hours after German units had started executing those intentions. To me, the Falaise Gap represents the fundamental problem of command in modern war. You're always fighting with yesterday's information against an enemy who's already moving on today's decisions. Ultra was revolutionary intelligence, giving Allied commanders access to enemy plans in near real time. But near real time in 1944 meant hours of delay, and hours mattered when armies were moving at mechanized speeds. Montgomery and Bradley made decisions based on the best intelligence available, and that intelligence was comprehensive but not instantaneous. Patton wanted to ignore the intelligence and drive north on instinct, trusting that aggression would solve problems that caution created. Maybe he was right. Maybe an aggressive thrust would have closed the gap faster. But the photographic evidence suggests otherwise, suggests that the Germans were already leaving, that the trap was closing on an enemy who'd recognized the danger and started moving before the Allies fully understood their own opportunity. That's not command failure. That's the nature of war, where knowledge lags action and decisions are made in fog that only clears in retrospect. The mythology blames Montgomery. The evidence blames physics, communication delays, and the fundamental impossibility of perfect knowledge in combat. I know which explanation I find more convincing. Chapter 8. The Supply Crisis No One Admits. Patton's September Stall. The 2nd of September, 1944, 3rd Army Logistics Center, somewhere in eastern France. Major Raymond Cobb sat at a folding table covered in fuel status reports, doing arithmetic that wouldn't balance. The morning report showed current fuel reserves at 31,000 gallons. The operations section's planned movement for the day required 400,000 gallons. The shortfall was 369,000 gallons, roughly 12 times what existed in every fuel dump, tank truck, and jerry can in 3rd Army's rear area. At the bottom of the status report, Cobb had written in pencil, "How?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. He genuinely didn't understand how the operations staff expected tanks to run on fuel that didn't exist. He'd tried explaining the mathematics to the chief of staff yesterday. The response had been unhelpful. Figure it out. The general wants to be in Germany by next week. Cobb looked at his numbers again. The laws of thermodynamics didn't care what the general wanted. The September stall of 3rd Army has been explained in official histories as a consequence of strategic priorities. Eisenhower diverted fuel and supplies to Montgomery's market garden operation, leaving Patton without resources to continue his rapid advance toward the Rhine. This explanation is factually true and strategically incomplete. What the fuel allocation numbers reveal is that Third Army's September halt wasn't imposed by higher command. It was predetermined by physics weeks earlier. Patton had been consuming fuel faster than the supply system could deliver it since mid-August, building a deficit that compounded daily until the army literally stopped moving because the tanks were empty. The allocation of fuel to Market Garden didn't cause the crisis. It simply made explicit what Cobb's reports had been screaming for weeks. You cannot sustain offensive operations when daily consumption exceeds daily delivery by 300,000 gallons. Arithmetic doesn't negotiate. When I started cross-referencing Third Army's fuel consumption logs with Red Ball Express delivery manifests, the timeline of the crisis became clear in a way that Patton's diary entries obscured. On August 25th, Third Army's armor advanced 73 miles in a single day, a spectacular demonstration of operational tempo, exactly the kind of aggressive movement Patton valued above all else. The fuel cost of that advance was 412,000 gallons. The Red Ball Express delivery for August 25th was 89,000 gallons. The deficit, 323,000 gallons, came from existing reserves that were already depleted from previous days' deficits. August 26th, advance 41 miles, consumed 270,000 gallons, received 94,000 gallons. August 27th, advance 56 miles, consumed 340,000 gallons, received 82,000 gallons. Every day the hole got deeper. By September 1st, Third Army's fuel reserves were gone. Not low, gone. Tanks stopped moving because their fuel tanks were literally empty. Cobb's memos to Third Army Chief of Staff show a logistics officer trying to explain reality to commanders who thought reality was negotiable. August 28th. At current consumption rates, Army will be immobile by September 6th. Patton's diary entry for August 28th. We can go all the way to Berlin if they let us. The disconnect is absolute. Cobb was reading fuel delivery manifests and calculating that operational movement would cease in 9 days. Patton was reading maps and imagining his tanks on the Rhine. Both men were looking at the same army. One saw thermodynamics, one saw destiny. September 6th came and went. Cobb's prediction was off by 1 day. Third Army stopped moving on September 5th. Cobb's September 5th memo to Eisenhower's headquarters is painfully precise. Third Army offensive operations suspended due to fuel exhaustion. Current reserve, 4,000 gallons. Required for resumption of operations, 380,000 gallons minimum. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck convoy system that's become legendary in logistics history, was already running at maximum capacity and still couldn't close the gap. The Express dedicated 899 trucks to Third Army supply, running 24-hour shifts on one-way routes from Normandy beaches to forward dumps in eastern France. The drivers were extraordinary, many of them African-American soldiers in segregated units who drove without sleep, without proper maintenance, without rest, because the front needed supplies and they were determined to deliver them. They averaged 89,000 gallons of fuel delivery per day in late August and early September. 89,000 gallons daily. It was a heroic logistical effort. It was also less than 1/4 of what Third Army was consuming. The mathematics were unforgiving. You can't advance at mechanized speeds when your supply line moves at truck speeds over roads that are cratered, mined, and 700 miles long. The comparative fuel allocations for September reveal the strategic calculus that Patton interpreted as betrayal. British Second Army received 1.4 million gallons per week. U.S. First Army received 1.1 million gallons per week. U.S. Third Army received 650,000 gallons per week. Eisenhower's allocation rationale, documented in a September 3rd memorandum, was explicit. Market Garden priority. Montgomery's attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine in Holland required fuel concentration in the northern sector. First Army, fighting directly toward Germany through the Siegfried Line, had operational priority over Third Army, which was on the southern flank in a sector considered less critical. This was strategic triage, allocating scarce resources to the operations most likely to end the war quickly. Patton saw it as political favoritism, a judgment documented across dozens of diary entries complaining about Ike's unwillingness to back a winner. What Patton didn't acknowledge, or didn't understand, was that even if he'd received First Army's allocation, 1.1 million gallons per week, it still would have been insufficient for the operational tempo he demanded. His August consumption averaged 1.6 million gallons per week. No allocation scenario made his vision sustainable. The Metz operation beginning September 7th shows what happens when an army designed for rapid movement is forced into siege warfare by fuel constraints. Metz was a fortified French city on the Moselle River, surrounded by 19th-century forts that the Germans had reinforced and garrisoned. Standard doctrine said bypass it, isolate it, let it wither while mobile forces continue east. Patton chose to assault it directly, partly because it blocked river crossings he needed, partly because bypassing felt like retreat. But the hidden reason, visible in Cobb's fuel reports, is simpler. Siege warfare consumes less fuel than mobile warfare. Tanks moving in deliberate assault consume approximately 190,000 gallons per day. Tanks advancing at pursuit speeds consume 400,000 gallons per day. Third Army couldn't afford pursuit. It could barely afford siege. So Patton laid siege to Metz and told himself it was strategic necessity. Cobb's September 10th report includes a handwritten note. Finally, an operation we can afford. The note suggests relief and perhaps sarcasm. Hard to tell from handwriting alone. The German intelligence intercepts are almost embarrassing in their accuracy. Wehrmacht intelligence analysts, reading Allied radio traffic and tracking fuel convoy frequencies, predicted Third Army's halt 4 days before it occurred. A German intelligence summary, dated September 1st, captured after the war and declassified in 1963, calculates Allied fuel delivery capacity based on observed convoy patterns and concludes, American Third Army advance unsustainable past September 5th, absent dramatic increase in supply throughput. They got the date right. Not because they had spies in Third Army headquarters, but because they did the same arithmetic Cobb was doing, counting trucks and calculating consumption rates. The Wehrmacht was fighting for its life, falling back across France, and still found time to calculate that the Americans chasing them would run out of gas before reaching the German border. And they were right. What fascinates me about the September stall is how completely Patton's post-war narrative obscured the logistical reality. In his memoir, War as I Knew It, Patton describes September 1944 as a period when timid strategy and political interference stopped Third Army from ending the war. He mentions fuel shortages once, in a subordinate clause, as if they were a minor inconvenience rather than an operational showstopper. But Cobb's daily fuel status reports tell a different story. Tell the story of an army that drove itself to exhaustion, that consumed resources faster than any supply system could deliver them, that mistook operational tempo for strategic vision without understanding that speed requires fuel, and fuel requires trucks, and trucks require roads, and roads require time. The halt wasn't imposed. It was inevitable. It was written into the mathematics of petroleum consumption from the moment Third Army started advancing faster than its supply lines could follow. To me, the September fuel crisis represents the clearest evidence of Patton's fundamental misunderstanding of modern war. He believed in will, in aggression, in the idea that determined commanders could overcome material limitations through sheer force of personality. And sometimes that worked. Sometimes pushing men harder extracted performances they didn't know they had in them. But you can't will fuel into existence. You can't intimidate a diesel engine into running on empty. The Sherman tank's fuel capacity was 60 gallons. Its cross-country range was 36 miles. Those are physical constants, as unchangeable as the speed of light. No amount of aggressive leadership makes a tank go farther on the same fuel. Patton spent September blaming Eisenhower for stopping him when the real culprit was thermodynamics. Cobb knew it. The Germans knew it. The Red Ball Express drivers knew it, driving themselves to exhaustion trying to deliver fuel that would never be enough. Only Patton, reading maps and dreaming of Berlin, seemed unable to grasp that his army had stopped moving because it had run out of energy. Literally, the tanks were empty, the war continued, and the general who prided himself on speed spent the autumn moving at the pace of a siege because that's all the fuel would allow. Chapter 9. The Metz Meat Grinder, Fortresses versus Hubris. The 18th of September, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters. Captain Harry Kemp stood in front of a map table, holding a captured French military blueprint dated 1899. The blueprint showed Fort Dryant, one of 12 major fortifications surrounding Metz, with detail that made Kemp's stomach tight. Walls 6 feet thick, reinforced concrete, interlocking fields of fire, underground galleries connecting defensive positions. The German annotation, added sometime after France fell in 1940, read in neat script: "Proof against all known artillery calibers." Kemp was the 5th Infantry Division intelligence officer, responsible for briefing Lieutenant General Patton on what his division would face when they assaulted the city. Patton arrived for the briefing at 1400 hours, listened for approximately 8 minutes, then interrupted. "Forts are monuments to man's stupidity," he said. "We'll go through them." Kemp tried to redirect attention to the blueprint. Patton didn't look at it. Kemp's diary entry that evening is 3 words. He didn't listen. The decision to assault Metz directly, rather than bypass it, represents one of the clearest examples of Patton choosing tactical theater over operational sense. Metz sat on the Moselle River, controlling crossing sites that 3rd Army needed to continue east toward the Siegfried Line. Standard doctrine for fortified cities in mobile warfare was isolation and bypass. Cut the city off from resupply, leave a screening force to contain the garrison, and continue the advance. This had worked at Brest, at Lorient, at Saint-Nazaire, where German-held ports were sealed off and left to surrender when they ran out of supplies. But Patton looked at Metz and saw something different, a challenge, a fortress that had never fallen by direct assault, a chance to prove that aggressive American infantry could do what the German army in 1940 and the French army in 1870 had failed to do. He saw history. Kemp saw concrete and casualties. Both were looking at the same city. Only one understood what the blueprints meant. The staff studies that recommended bypass are still in the archives, and they're remarkably prescient. A 3rd Army planning assessment dated September 20th estimates that direct assault on Metz would require 6 weeks of siege operations, cost approximately 15,000 casualties, and divert combat power from the primary objective of breaching the Siegfried Line. The same assessment estimates that bypass and isolation would take 10 days, cost fewer than 1,000 casualties, and allow continued eastward movement. The recommendation is unambiguous. Recommend bypass and isolation. Direct assault not operationally justified. Patton's response to this assessment, documented in a staff meeting summary, was equally unambiguous. Forts are psychological obstacles, not physical ones. Aggressive infantry will take them in days. The staff officers apparently didn't argue further. There's no record of continued discussion. Patton had decided. The Army would assault Metz, and 5th Infantry Division would pay the bill. The assault on Fort Dryant, October 3rd through 13th, became a case study in what happens when 19th-century fortifications meet 20th-century hubris. 5th Infantry Division committed 4 battalions, approximately 4,000 men, to reducing a single fort defended by 448 German soldiers. The initial assault on October 3rd penetrated the outer earthworks and took control of surface structures. Then the defenders retreated into the underground galleries, sealed the steel doors, and waited. American infantry followed them into tunnels where artillery support couldn't help, where air support was irrelevant, where it became knife fighting in darkness against defenders who knew every passage. The after-action report for October 3rd through October 13th is clinical in its precision. 738 American casualties, penetration limited to outer works, structural damage to fortifications assessed as negligible. 448 Germans had held off 4,000 Americans for 10 days. The fort remained in German hands. The artillery expenditure at Metz shows what happens when firepower doctrine meets physics-resistant targets. Third Army artillery fired 91,000 rounds at Metz fortifications during October. 91,000 shells, 105 mm, 155 mm, 8-inch howitzer fire, everything the artillery could bring to bear. Post-battle engineering surveys assessed the structural damage to fort walls at approximately 11%. 11%. 100 million pounds of high explosive, my rough calculation based on standard shell weights, had chipped away roughly 1/10 of the fortification's defensive integrity. The cost per cubic foot of concrete destroyed worked out to approximately $47,000 in 1944 currency. This wasn't warfare. This was the world's most expensive demolition project, conducted against a target that didn't need to be demolished because it could have been bypassed. What strikes me most about the Metz campaign is the casualty profile, which reveals a preventable disaster conducted in slow motion. Third Army casualties from September 7th through November 22nd, the entire Metz siege, totaled 4,483 killed, 17,962 wounded, 2,431 missing. 24,876 total casualties. For context, that exceeded Patton's entire North African campaign casualties. It exceeded Third Army's casualties during the August pursuit across France. It exceeded losses in any comparable period of Third Army operations. And all of it for a city that could have been bypassed and isolated at near zero cost, allowing those divisions to continue the primary mission of breaching Germany's western defenses. The operational opportunity cost, what Third Army could have achieved in those 11 weeks if it hadn't been grinding against Metz fortifications, is incalculable, but enormous. The weather made it worse. October and November in Lorraine brought rain, cold, and the kind of misery that turns combat into an endurance test beyond the fighting itself. Third Army medical evacuation records show that 23% of Metz casualties were classified as trench foot and exposure. Cold weather injuries that spiked because the siege extended into November weather that Patton's original timeline assumed they'd avoid. Men standing in flooded foxholes for days waiting to assault concrete bunkers developed foot rot that required evacuation and sometimes amputation. The medical term is non-battle injury, which makes it sound administrative, but trench foot in advanced stages is amputation-level tissue death caused by prolonged cold and wet. 5th Infantry Division medical logs for November showed trench foot admissions exceeding combat casualties on multiple days. They were losing more men to weather than to German fire. And all of it was avoidable. Bypass Metz in September, and those divisions are fighting from prepared positions in Germany, not standing in French mud besieging forts that would have surrendered when their supplies ran out. The final surrender of Metz on November 22nd came not from American assault breaking through, but from German logistics exhaustion. The garrison commander's report, captured when the city fell, is almost apologetic. Ammunition expended. Rations insufficient. Medical supplies exhausted. Continued defense serves no purpose. They didn't surrender because the fortifications failed. Post-surrender inspections showed the major forts remained structurally intact, fully capable of continued resistance. They surrendered because they ran out of everything except concrete. Which is exactly what happens when you bypass and isolate a fortress. You wait for it to starve. Patton had chosen the expensive, casualty-intensive method of achieving the same result. Except instead of waiting for logistics to strangle the garrison, he'd spent 11 weeks and 25,000 casualties doing it the hard way. When Metz finally fell, Third Army engineers surveyed the fortifications and confirmed what Kemp's September briefing had predicted. The forts were essentially undamaged. All that artillery, all those casualties, all those weeks, and the fortifications stood intact. The Germans left because they were hungry, not because the walls fell. What fascinates me about Patton's response to the Metz stalemate is the complete absence of self-reflection in his diary or official reports. November 23, the day after Metz surrendered. Metz falls to Third Army aggressive tactics. Another fortress proves vulnerable to determined assault. There's no mention of the 11-week timeline, no acknowledgement that the siege lasted 5 times longer than initial estimates, no reference to the casualty count that exceeded every comparable operation. Just vindication, proof that his doctrine of aggressive assault could reduce any obstacle. Meanwhile, Kemp's after-action report, filed through intelligence channels, is brutally honest. Fort Driant assault demonstrated that 19th-century fortifications remain resistant to 20th-century artillery when defended by competent troops. Recommend future operations bypass such objectives unless operationally critical. Metz was not operationally critical. The gap between those two assessments, Patton's triumphalism and Kemp's clinical honesty, represents the gap between mythology and reality. To me, Metz represents the moment when Patton's greatest strength became his greatest liability. His willingness to accept casualties, to drive men hard, to refuse to acknowledge obstacles, all the qualities that made him effective in pursuit warfare, became liabilities in siege warfare. You can't intimidate concrete. You can't outflank fortifications through aggressive maneuver when they're fixed in place and you need the ground they occupy. Metz required patience, engineering, and a willingness to accept that some problems can't be solved by attacking harder. Patton had none of those qualities. So he attacked harder and kept attacking until the enemy ran out of food. 25,000 casualties to achieve what isolation would have accomplished at zero cost. And the worst part, the part that keeps me returning to Kemp's September briefing notes, is that every single casualty was predicted. The staff studies said 6 weeks and 15,000 casualties. They were optimistic. It took 11 weeks and 25,000 casualties. But the fundamental prediction was accurate. Direct assault on Metz would be slow, bloody, and unnecessary. Patton ordered it anyway. Because forts are monuments to man's stupidity, and aggressive commanders prove their worth by destroying monuments. Even when destroying them costs more than walking around them. Especially then. Chapter 10. The Lorraine Mud, When Weather Beats Tactics. The 14th of October, 1944. Nancy Airfield, Eastern France. The meteorological officer wrote his morning weather report in careful block letters. Rainfall 4.7 inches past 72 hours. Ground saturation estimated 140%. Soil bearing strength insufficient for tracked vehicle operations. He attached the report to Captain James Polk's morning fuel and maintenance summary, knowing that Polk would understand what the numbers meant even if the operations staff didn't. Polk was 3rd Army's ordnance officer, responsible for keeping tanks operational, and he'd been watching the maintenance logs with growing alarm. 347 tanks deadlined in the past week, not from combat damage, but from track and suspension failures caused by operating in mud that exceeded design parameters. The Sherman tank was engineered to ford streams up to 36 inches deep. Lorraine mud in October was effectively bottomless. Tanks were drowning on dry land. The autumn stall of 3rd Army has been explained as a consequence of strategic priorities, fuel shortages, and German resistance stiffening along the Moselle River. All true. All incomplete. What the vehicle readiness reports reveal is that 3rd Army faced a third opponent in October and November 1944, one that couldn't be shot or outmaneuvered, atmospheric conditions that turned the Lorraine Plateau into a mechanical killing field. When I started cross-referencing meteorological records with ordnance maintenance logs, the pattern became undeniable. Tank operational readiness dropped from 83% on October 11th to 61% on October 18th, a 22-point collapse in 1 week. German action accounted for some losses. Weather accounted for most. Tanks designed to operate in North African desert or French roads simply broke when asked to maneuver through saturated clay soil that clung to tracks, jammed suspensions, and turned every movement into a wrestling match with physics. Polk's October 20th report to 3rd Army headquarters reads like a logistics officer's scream into the void. Tank recovery operations now exceed combat losses. Current deadline vehicles, 419. Primary cause, mechanical failure due to terrain conditions exceeding operational parameters. Recommendation: suspend offensive operations until ground conditions improve, or accept vehicle attrition rate that will render armored divisions combat ineffective by mid-November. The response from operations staff, documented in Polk's files, was brief. Recommendation noted: continue operations. So they continued. And tanks continued to break. October 21st, 473 deadline vehicles. October 22nd, 512. The graph line on Polk's daily readiness chart tilted downward like a dive bomber. By October 25th, Third Army's operational armor strength had dropped to 54%. Slightly better than half the tanks could move. The rest sat in fields, waiting for recovery vehicles that were themselves breaking down from overuse. The comparative data with German forces shows that Lorraine Mud was an equal opportunity destroyer of mechanized warfare. Wehrmacht records captured after the city of Metz fell include vehicle readiness reports from defending units, and the numbers are grimly similar. October 20th, 41% armor operational rate. The Germans were failing too, their Panther and Tiger tanks suffering the same suspension failures, the same track damage, the same mechanical attrition that plagued American armor. In a perverse way, this leveled the battlefield. Neither side could maneuver effectively, so the campaign devolved into static fighting that resembled World War I more than the mobile operations both armies preferred. But there's a critical difference. German forces were defending, which requires less mechanical reliability than attacking. A broken-down German tank in a defensive position can still fight. A broken-down American tank trying to advance is just an expensive roadblock. The weather favored defense. Patton was attacking. The math didn't work. The human cost of fighting in Lorraine Mud appears in the medical statistics, which tell a story parallel to the mechanical failures. Between October 15th and November 30th, Third Army medical facilities admitted 4,738 soldiers for trench foot and respiratory illness, cold and wet-related conditions that weren't combat wounds, but removed men from combat as effectively as bullets. On multiple days in November, medical admissions for exposure-related illness exceeded combat casualties. November 8th, 132 combat casualties, 197 trench foot and respiratory admissions. The soldiers weren't just fighting Germans, they were fighting hypothermia, pneumonia, and the slow tissue death that comes from standing in water-filled foxholes for days. These casualties don't appear in battle narratives, they appear in medical logs, in the administrative paperwork of an army destroying itself through attrition that had nothing to do with enemy action. The engineering response to Lorraine Mud shows what happens when institutional solutions can't match the scale of the problem. Third Army engineers constructed 47 miles of corduroy road in October, logs laid perpendicular to the road direction, creating a semi-solid surface for vehicle traffic. The construction effort consumed 18,000 logs, required round-the-clock work by engineer battalions, and represented a genuine attempt to build infrastructure that could support mechanized operations in unsuitable terrain. 47 miles of road. It degraded to impassability within 72 hours of completion. The weight of supply trucks, tanks, and half-tracks ground the logs into the mud beneath, creating not a road, but a log-studded swamp. Engineer reports from early November recommend abandoning corduroy construction as ineffective given traffic loads and soil conditions. The recommendation was accepted. Third Army stopped building roads and started accepting that movement would be slow, difficult, and mechanically destructive. What strikes me about the October vehicle recovery statistics is the implication for operational tempo. Third Army recovery vehicles, M26 Dragon Wagons, and M1 Heavy Wreckers logged 4,117 tank recovery operations in October. 4,000 recoveries in 31 days. That's an average of 133 tanks recovered per day, which exceeded the planned recovery capacity of the entire European theater by 340%. The recovery units were performing miracles, working in mud that made their own vehicles prone to getting stuck, using winches and cables to extract 60-ton tanks from ground that held them like quicksand. And they were still falling behind. Polk's October 28 memorandum includes a calculation that haunts me. At current attrition rates, Third Army will have 0 operational tanks by December 4, 1944. 0 tanks by early December. The projection assumed weather conditions remained constant and no dramatic improvement in recovery or maintenance capacity. Both assumptions were reasonable. The projection was terrifying. The weather forecasting failure shows how imperfect meteorological science was in 1944 and how much operational planning depended on predictions that proved wrong. German meteorological services, working from captured records and post-war interrogations, accurately predicted the November freeze that would harden the ground and make mechanized operations feasible again. They forecast the freeze for November 10th, plus or minus 2 days. It arrived November 11th. American meteorological services, working with less comprehensive data and less sophisticated modeling, predicted the freeze for October 31st. They were off by 11 days. Those 11 days mattered enormously because they represented the window when Patton continued offensive operations in weather that made those operations mechanically unsustainable. Had American weather forecasts been more accurate, October's operations might have been suspended earlier, preserving vehicles and men for the November offensive when ground conditions improved. Instead, Third Army ground itself down in late October, pursuing objectives that November's frozen ground would make achievable at lower cost. The soil mechanics are worth understanding because they explain why the problem was so intractable. Lorraine clay soil, when saturated beyond approximately 90% water content, loses structural integrity. It becomes effectively liquid, unable to bear point loads. The Sherman tank exerted approximately 13 pounds per square inch of ground pressure through its tracks. Saturated Lorraine clay had a bearing strength of roughly 8 pounds per square inch. Every tank movement created ground pressure that exceeded the soil's capacity to resist, causing the tracks to sink. In dry conditions, tracks bite into firm soil and propel the tank forward. In saturated conditions, tracks churn through liquid clay, finding no purchase, sinking deeper with each rotation. The physics are unforgiving. And here's the cruel detail. German Panther tanks, which were heavier than Sherman's, had wider tracks that distributed weight more evenly. In theory, this should have helped. In practice, the additional weight negated the advantage. Panthers sank just as badly as Sherman's, just for different mechanical reasons. Both armies were defeated by hydrology. To me, the Lorraine Mud Campaign represents the clearest evidence that weather is a combatant, not a condition. Patton's October and November operations faced 3 enemies: German forces, mechanical attrition, and atmospheric conditions. Of the 3, atmospheric conditions probably inflicted the most operational damage. The Germans could be fought to a standstill. Mechanical failures could be repaired, given time and parts. But weather was absolute. You couldn't negotiate with rain, couldn't intimidate mud, couldn't outflank the laws of soil mechanics. Patton tried anyway. He kept attacking because stopping felt like surrender, because admitting that weather had defeated him was psychologically impossible for a general who'd built his reputation on refusing to acknowledge obstacles. So Third Army attacked through October, losing tanks to mud at rates that would have been unsustainable even without enemy action, burning through recovery capacity and maintenance parts and soldiers' health in pursuit of objectives that the November freeze would make achievable at a fraction of the cost. Polk knew it. The meteorologists knew it. The tank crews sinking into Lorraine clay knew it. Only Patton, reading situation maps that showed division positions without showing the mud those divisions were drowning in, seemed unable to accept that sometimes the weather wins. You can't shoot rain. You can't advance against atmospheric conditions, and a general who refuses to acknowledge that basic reality doesn't demonstrate determination. He demonstrates the difference between courage and competence. October 1944 was competence gap made visible in maintenance logs and weather reports. The tanks stopped moving because the ground wouldn't let them. And all the aggressive leadership in the world couldn't change the bearing strength of saturated soil. Chapter 11. The Hammelburg Raid, Personal Mission, Official Disaster. The 26th of March, 1945, 3rd Army Headquarters. Colonel Charles Codman sat in the staff meeting listening to Lieutenant General Patton outline an operation that made every staff officer in the room uncomfortable. A raid deep behind German lines, 60 miles beyond friendly positions, to liberate the POW camp at Oflag 13B near Hammelburg. The stated objective was POW liberation. The unstated reason, the one nobody was mentioning, sat in Patton's personnel file. His son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was being held at Hammelburg. Patton knew this because Red Cross reports confirmed Waters' location. The staff knew Patton knew because they'd seen him reviewing those reports. And now they were being asked to approve an operation that violated every principle of raid doctrine. Too deep, too small a force, too little supporting action, because the commanding general wanted to rescue his daughter's husband. Codman's diary entry that evening is precise. GSP determined to send force to Hammelburg. Staff objections noted, overruled. I asked about his son-in-law's POW status. He said, "That's irrelevant." The quote mark suggests Codman recorded the exact words. The tone suggests he didn't believe them. The bureaucratic paper trail of the Hammelburg raid reveals an institutional command structure struggling to manage a general who decided to violate his own doctrine for personal reasons. Operations Order 12th Corps/32745, dated March 26, tasks a combined arms force with Liberation Raid, Oflag 13B. The typed order is routine. The handwritten notation from the Corps G3, the operations officer, is not. Recommend against. Force inadequate. Distance excessive. C.G. Patton insists. That notation is extraordinary because it documents, in real time, staff-level awareness that the operation was tactically unsound, and command-level insistence on executing it anyway. In a functional command structure, the G3's recommendation against would have triggered review, discussion, possibly cancellation. In 3rd Army, in March 1945, it triggered nothing except the operation proceeding as ordered. Patton had decided. The staff documented their objections. The raid launched. Task Force Bomb, named for Captain Abraham Baum, who would command the raid, consisted of 294 men, 53 vehicles, and 10 medium tanks. Standard Army doctrine for deep raids recommended force-to-distance ratios of approximately 1,000 men per 20 miles of penetration, with the understanding that maintaining a corridor through enemy territory requires forces to hold both the objective and the route. 60 miles at doctrinal ratios suggested a force of 3,000 men minimum. Patton sent 294. The arithmetic was impossible from the start. You cannot hold 60 miles of road with 300 men, cannot suppress enemy forces along the entire route, cannot guarantee extraction even if you reach the objective. Ranger doctrine, developed through painful experience in North Africa and Italy, explicitly warned against deep raids with inadequate forces. Patton ignored all of it. When 12th Corps staff pointed out the force-to-distance problem, Patton's response, recorded in the Corps commander's log, was dismissive. Speed and surprise will compensate. They didn't. The raid execution on March 27th demonstrated what happens when tactics meet reality. Task Force Bomb crossed the line of departure at 0200 hours, moving through darkness toward Hammelburg 60 miles distant. First enemy contact came at 8 miles, German forces tracking the American column, radioing ahead, organizing ambushes. The combat log, reconstructed from survivor accounts after the task force was destroyed, reads like a slow-motion catastrophe. Mile 12, machine gun ambush, 2 vehicles destroyed. Mile 18, anti-tank fire, 1 medium tank knocked out. Mile 27, artillery barrage, casualties mounting. Mile 34, German blocking position, hour-long firefight to break through. The task force reached Hammelburg on March 27th at approximately 1500 hours, 13 hours after departure, having fought nearly continuous engagements across 60 miles. They liberated the camp. They freed approximately 1,500 prisoners, though only a handful could fit on the remaining vehicles. And then they tried to fight their way back. The casualty count tells the story the official reports tried to obscure. Of 294 men who began the raid, 32 were killed, 32 wounded, 230 captured. The mission commander, Captain Baum, was captured. Every tank was destroyed or abandoned. Every vehicle was lost. Of the prisoners liberated, 4 joined the task force's attempted withdrawal, including Lieutenant Colonel Waters, who was shot and wounded during the camp approach, not by Germans, but in the confused, close-quarters fighting when American troops approached the wire. Waters survived his wound. He was recaptured when the task force collapsed. He remained a POW until conventional American forces liberated Hammelburg 6 days later on April 2nd. 6 days. Patton's raid cost 300 men and accomplished nothing that wouldn't have been achieved by waiting less than a week for the regular advance to reach the camp. The operational cost-benefit analysis is devastating. 300 casualties for 0 operational gain. What strikes me most about the Hammelburg documentation is the careful construction of the official narrative versus the private acknowledgement of disaster. Patton's after-action report, filed through official channels, describes the mission as POW liberation attempt, unsuccessful due to enemy strength. No mention of Waters. No acknowledgement of family connection. The report treats Hammelburg as a tactical risk that didn't pay off, unfortunate but within the normal range of operational outcomes. But Codman's diary and 12th Corps staff meeting notes tell a different story. April 2nd, the day conventional forces reached Hammelburg, asked GSP about the raid now that we've reached the camp anyway. He changed subject. April 5th, after Eisenhower's inquiry about operational justification. GSP drafting response. Omits family connection. Everyone knows. Nobody says. The unspoken truth that Patton had risked 300 men for personal reasons circulated through 3rd Army headquarters like smoke, acknowledged by everyone, documented by no one except in private diaries that wouldn't be read for decades. Eisenhower's inquiry, dated April 2nd, is carefully worded to avoid direct accusation while demanding justification. Explain tactical justification for task force bomb operation given force-to-distance ratios and alternative of conventional advance reaching Oflag 13B within 1 week. The inquiry doesn't mention Waters. It doesn't need to. Eisenhower knew. Bradley knew. The entire senior command structure knew that Patton had sent a task force to rescue his son-in-law. But actually stating it in official correspondence would require court-martial proceedings, relief from command, public scandal. So Eisenhower asked for tactical justification, knowing there wasn't one, knowing Patton would provide bureaucratic cover, knowing that everyone would pretend the operation was a legitimate military mistake rather than a personal mission dressed in operational orders. Patton's response to Eisenhower references liberation opportunity and intelligence suggesting immediate rescue feasible. No mention of Waters. The lie by omission was accepted. The matter was closed. The private correspondence reveals what the official record conceals. Patton's letter to his wife Beatrice, dated March 28th, the day after the raid launched, is extraordinarily revealing. Sent a force to liberate a POW camp. John may be there. Hope it works. John was Waters. May be there was a lie. Patton knew exactly where Waters was because Red Cross documentation had confirmed it. But the phrasing, casual, hopeful, slightly uncertain, provided deniability. If the letter were ever reviewed, Patton could claim he'd sent the raid for general POW liberation and only hoped his son-in-law might benefit incidentally. The construction is careful, the intent is transparent, and Beatrice, reading between the lines of a marriage that had lasted decades, knew exactly what her husband had done and why. Her response, preserved in the Patton papers, is 2 sentences. "Praying for John's safety, please be careful." Not "good operational decision" or "hope the mission succeeds," just prayers and caution. She understood the stakes. The post-war assessment of Hammelburg by Army historians is buried in footnotes and appendices where uncomfortable truths go to die quietly. The official history of Third Army operations mentions the raid in a single paragraph, describing it as an unsuccessful attempt to liberate Allied prisoners. The multi-volume European theater operational history includes slightly more detail, noting force size inadequate for mission depth, but attributing this to intelligence failure regarding enemy strength. Neither mentions waters. Neither acknowledges the family connection. Neither treats Hammelburg as what it obviously was, a commanding general using military resources for personal purposes, risking lives to rescue his son-in-law, and then constructing a bureaucratic narrative to obscure his motives. The truth is in the documentary record, in Codman's diary, in the G3's handwritten objections, in the casualty lists, in the timeline showing the camp would have been liberated conventionally within a week. But the official history protects the general's reputation by treating his most indefensible operation as merely unfortunate. To me, Hammelburg represents the moment when Patton's command authority became indistinguishable from personal prerogative. Every commanding general makes mistakes. Every operation carries risk. But Hammelburg wasn't a calculated risk that failed. It was a personal mission executed with military resources and justified through retroactive narrative construction. 300 men paid for Patton's inability to separate his role as commander from his role as father-in-law. And the institutional army, from Eisenhower down through the history-writing apparatus, chose to protect Patton's legacy rather than honestly document his abuse of command. The paper trail is there if you look. The staff objections, the impossible force ratios, the convenient omission of waters from official reports, the 6-day gap between the raid and the conventional liberation that made the raid pointless, all there. All documented, all carefully excluded from the narratives that built the Patton legend. Reading Codman's diary entries from late March and early April, I can feel his discomfort. The aide who knows his general has crossed a line, who documents it privately but can't challenge it publicly, who watches 300 men become casualties in a mission that never should have been approved. That discomfort is the sound of institutional integrity breaking. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small decisions to protect reputation over truth. Hammelburg should have ended Patton's career. Instead, it became a footnote. That tells you everything about how military history gets written. Chapter 12. The Bulge, Patton's Pivot or Eisenhower's Contingency. The 19th of December, 1944. SHAEF Headquarters, Versailles. Brigadier General Arthur Nevins sat in the operations center, watching colored pins move on a wall map of Belgium. The German offensive was 60 hours old, punching through the Ardennes with more force than Allied intelligence had predicted possible. Phone lines to forward units were cutting out. Radio traffic was confused, and in Washington, the press was starting to ask whether the Wehrmacht had one more surprise left in it. Nevins was SHAEFG-3, responsible for operational planning, and he'd been working contingencies since December 17th, before most people understood the scale of what was happening. His staff had run movement calculations for redeploying Third Army north toward Bastogne. They'd mapped supply routes, calculated fuel requirements, identified road networks. Now, at 14:30 hours on December 19th, Nevins was waiting for the conference at Verdun, where Eisenhower would ask Patton the question everyone expected. When can you attack? Nevins already knew the answer because his staff had calculated it 72 hours earlier. December 22nd. The timeline was determined by road distances and division march rates, not by command genius. The mythology of the Bulge has Patton performing a miracle, pivoting his entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours, attacking north to relieve Bastogne through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. It's a good story. It's supported by Patton's diary, by post-war memoirs, by the legitimate achievement of moving 133,000 men 75 to 100 miles in winter conditions on crowded roads. What the story omits is that SHAEF operations staff had begun planning Third Army's redeployment before Patton knew there was a German offensive. When I started pulling the planning documents from the Eisenhower Library, the movement orders, the fuel allocation priorities, the supply rerouting instructions, the timeline became clear. This wasn't Patton's improvisation. This was Nevin's contingency plan, executed with impressive speed by Third Army staff who'd been preparing for it since December 17th. The documentary evidence is unambiguous. SHAEF Operations Order 12-1944A, dated December 19th at 1100 hours, tasks contingent redeployment of Third Army Northern Flank Forces to Arlon-Bastogne axis. The order is time-stamped 9 hours before the Verdun Conference, where Patton famously volunteered Third Army for the relief mission. 9 hours. The order didn't say if Patton agrees or pending Third Army concurrence. It said redeploy. The conference at Verdun, where Eisenhower asked when Patton could attack, and Patton answered December 22nd to reportedly stunned silence, wasn't a moment of inspired improvisation. It was Patton confirming a timeline that SHAEF staff had already calculated and that his own staff had briefed him on, using contingency plans developed days earlier. The miracle wasn't the pivot. The miracle was making it look spontaneous. Nevin's staff meeting notes from December 17th, the second day of the German offensive, show contingency planning already in motion. German Offensive Day 2. Begin contingency routing for strategic reserve commitment. Third Army Northern Flank most flexible. The meeting timestamp is 14:30 hours. Patton's diary indicates he learned of the offensive at approximately 1900 hours that evening from a phone call with Bradley. By the time Patton knew there was a crisis, SHAEF staff had already identified Third Army as the most logical response force and begun preliminary movement planning. This doesn't diminish Third Army's execution. Moving that many men that quickly was genuinely impressive logistics work. But it does complicate the narrative of Patton's individual genius. The framework for the movement existed before he arrived at the planning table. The fuel allocation orders tell the same story. On December 18th, before the Verdun Conference, before Patton's December 22nd pronouncement, SHAEF Logistics issued priority fuel allocation, redirecting Red Ball Express convoys north to support Third Army redeployment. The order references anticipated Third Army movement toward Ardennes sector and adjusts fuel dump locations accordingly. Anticipated. December 18th. The logistics infrastructure was being repositioned before Patton officially committed to the attack. Either SHAEF was remarkably prescient, or they'd already decided Third Army would execute the relief and were preparing the supply chain to support it. The documentary record suggests the latter. Patton's attack order came after the fuel had already been rerouted. The Verdun Conference on December 19th at 1000 hours has been described in multiple memoirs, each version slightly different, but all agreeing on the dramatic moment when Eisenhower asked about attack timing. Patton, December 22nd. Room reportedly silent, generals stunned by the aggressive timeline. But Nevin's notes from that conference include a detail that changes the interpretation. C.G. Patton confirms timeline our staff calculated December 17th. Good. Confirms. Not proposes, not improvises, not miraculously produces. Confirms. The timeline existed. Patton was briefed on it. His own staff had received SHAEF's contingency planning guidance and done their own calculations, arriving at the same December 22nd date. At Verdun, Patton was delivering a prepared answer to an expected question, performing certainty for an audience that needed to see command confidence. Theater, not improvisation. Effective theater, but theater nonetheless. The actual redeployment between December 19th and 21st was extraordinary, regardless of whose plan it was. Third Army moved 133,178 soldiers and 11,000 vehicles between 75 and 100 miles in 48 hours of December weather, on roads choked with refugees, retreating units, and supply convoys. The staff work was phenomenal. traffic control points established, routes deconflicted, units leapfrogged through congestion points, fuel dumps pre-positioned. This was institutional competence at scale, the kind of complex logistics operation that requires hundreds of officers doing detailed planning and thousands of soldiers executing precisely. Patton's contribution was setting the tone, demanding speed, accepting risk, pushing subordinates to move faster than they thought possible. That's leadership. But the mechanics of how to move a corps 90 degrees had been worked out by staff officers before Patton gave the order. The plan enabled the pivot. The pivot didn't create the plan. The multi-axis relief of Bastogne shows how the post-war American narrative compressed a coalition effort into a single general story. Patton's 4th Armored Division, attacking from the south, entered Bastogne on December 26th. That's documented, celebrated, true. What's less emphasized is that 87th Infantry Division, also 3rd Army, arrived on Bastogne's eastern flank the same day. And 17th Airborne Division, Strategic Reserve, not 3rd Army, arrived on the western flank December 27th. Bastogne was relieved by 3 divisions on 3 axes. Patton commanded 1 axis. The official narrative remembers 1 axis. The difference matters because it reveals how individual command gets credit for institutional effort. 3rd Army's southern attack was critical. It wasn't singular. British 10th 10 Corps was driving toward Bastogne from the north. 18th Airborne Corps was attacking from the west. This was a coordinated multinational relief operation. Patton's piece was important. It wasn't the whole operation. The fuel consumption data reveals how SHAEF's preparation enabled Patton's speed. 3rd Army consumed 782,000 gallons of fuel between December 22nd and December 26th during the Bastogne relief. 782,000 gallons in 5 days. That fuel came from strategic reserves that Eisenhower had allocated to 3rd Army before Patton's attack began. Reserves drawn from other units, rerouted from planned operations, concentrated in northern France, specifically to support the relief operation. The fuel didn't appear because Patton demanded it. It appeared because SHAEF Logistics had calculated requirements and repositioned resources starting December 18th. When 3rd Army's tanks rolled north, they rolled on fuel that had been allocated, transported, and stockpiled as part of a theater-level contingency plan. Patton's armor moved fast because someone else had done the arithmetic and positioned the gas. What fascinates me about the bulge narrative is how completely it's been personalized around Patton when the documentary record shows institutional planning enabling individual execution. The pivot was real. The speed was impressive. The relief of Bastogne was critical. All true. But the framework for that pivot, the movement calculations, the fuel allocations, the road routing, the contingency planning, existed before Patton walked into the Verdun conference room. Nevins and his staff had done the work. 3rd Army's logistics officers had executed the preparation. The institutional army had responded to crisis with systematic planning. And Patton arrived, confirmed the timeline, and got the credit. That's not a criticism of Patton. Commanding generals are supposed to execute staff plans with confidence and drive. But it's a correction of the mythology that treats the bulge pivot as individual genius rather than institutional competence. The genius was in the staff work, the logistics preparation, the systematic contingency planning that made rapid redeployment possible. Patton's contribution was speed and aggressive execution, essential but not miraculous. To me, reading Nevin's December 17th planning notes alongside Patton's December 19th diary entry, the gap between preparation and perception becomes clear. Nevins: begin contingency routing for strategic reserve commitment. Patton: when I said I could attack in 3 days, they looked at me like I was crazy. One man describing systematic planning. One man describing individual inspiration. Both describing the same operation. The official history has sided with Patton's version, the story of the general who performed a miracle. The documentary record suggests Nevin's version, the story of a staff that planned a contingency and a general who executed it with conviction. History prefers the former because it's more dramatic, more personal, more emotionally satisfying. But the fuel allocation orders, the movement timelines, the contingency planning documents all point toward the latter. The miracle was preparation disguised as improvisation. The pivot was planned before it was ordered. And the general who got the credit was confirming a timeline, not creating one. That's how institutions work when they work well. Staff officers solve problems in advance. Commanding generals execute with confidence. And the mythology credits individual genius for collective competence. The bulge was Patton's finest moment. It was also Nevin's finest planning exercise. Both can be true. Only one made the history books. Chapter 13. The Rhine Crossing. Engineering Triumph. Command Sideshow. The 23rd of March, 1945. 0 to 34 hours. Oppenheim, Germany. Major Russell Akers stood knee-deep in the Rhine River, holding a measuring rod that showed current speed at 4.2 miles per hour. Moonless night. Cold water. Small arms fire from the east bank crackling sporadically across the water. German defenders reacting to sounds they couldn't see. Akers was the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion Operations Officer, and for the past 72 hours, his men had been preparing for this moment, surveying the riverbed, mapping underwater obstacles, pre-assembling bridge sections in concealed positions 2 miles back from the waterline. The bridge construction log, which Akers kept in a waterproof notebook, recorded the timestamp when the first float section entered the water, 0234. No mention of the commanding general. No notation about 3rd Army headquarters. Just engineers doing engineering in darkness, beginning the most critical construction project of the European campaign while generals slept. The bridge would take 10 hours and 14 minutes to complete. Patton would arrive to photograph it after the hard work was done. The Rhine crossing narrative has Patton seizing an opportunity, exploiting German weakness, improvising a crossing that caught the enemy off balance. The engineer battalion records tell a different story. Tell the story of methodical preparation beginning March 18th, 5 days before the assault. Reconnaissance teams had surveyed crossing sites starting March 18th, identifying Oppenheim as optimal based on river width, current speed, bank conditions, and road access. Underwater demolition teams had cleared obstacles March 20th through 21st, working at night to remove German obstacles without alerting defenders. Float assembly areas had been established March 21st, with bridge components staged under camouflage netting. By March 22nd, when Patton's attack order was issued at 1400 hours, engineer units had already completed 4 days of specific preparation. The crossing wasn't impromptu. It was the culmination of engineering work that began before infantry commanders knew the mission. When I started examining the bridge construction logs alongside Patton's diary entries, describing the Rhine assault as opportunistic, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Patton's diary, March 22nd. Discovered opportunity to bounce the Rhine, will exploit immediately. Engineers preparation timeline, reconnaissance, March 18th. Obstacle clearance, March 19th through 21st, float assembly, March 22nd. The opportunity Patton discovered was an engineering project already 4 days into execution. This doesn't diminish the achievement. Crossing the Rhine under fire was dangerous and difficult, regardless of preparation. But it does shift credit from command improvisation to engineering competence. The opportunity existed because engineers had created it through systematic preparation. Patton recognized it and gave the order. The engineers made it possible. The assault crossing on the night of March 22nd into March 23rd shows infantry courage and engineering precision working in concert. 5th Infantry Division launched assault boats at 2300 hours, small infantry units paddling across in darkness, establishing a bridgehead on the east bank, suppressing German defensive fire enough for engineers to begin bridge construction. The assault boat crews were extraordinarily brave, crossing nearly 1,000 feet of open water under fire, knowing that river current would sweep them downstream if they didn't maintain exact headings. Casualties were surprisingly light. Initial crossing elements reported 14% losses, far below the expected 30% for opposed river crossings. Why? Because engineer reconnaissance had identified the crossing site as lightly defended, had timed the assault for the moment when German defenders were rotating shifts, had positioned artillery to suppress known defensive positions. The courage was real. The planning made the courage survivable. The bridge construction itself was the real miracle of the operation, though it's received a fraction of the attention that Patton's crossing has. Acres construction log shows the timeline. First float section in water at 0234. Anchor cables secured 0310. First deck panels installed 0415. German artillery fire began 0447. Intermittent but accurate enough to kill 2 engineers and wound 7. Construction continued. Midpoint reached 0722. German counter-battery fire silenced enemy guns 0835, allowing uninterrupted work for the final hours. Final connection made 12:48, 10 hours, 14 minutes from start to finish. A treadway bridge 1,040 feet long, capable of supporting 30-ton loads, built under fire in darkness across a major river. The specialized equipment required: 27 bridge trucks, 2 bridge cranes, 184 individual float sections, had been pre-positioned based on reconnaissance conducted 5 days earlier. This wasn't improvisation. This was industrial-scale engineering executed with military precision. The casualty rate among engineers during bridge construction reveals how dangerous the work was despite successful completion. 7% casualties during construction, 2 killed, 14 wounded from the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion. That's 1 in 14 engineers becoming a casualty while building infrastructure. Compare that to 5th Infantry Division's assault crossing casualties of 14%, and the engineer casualty rate looks almost acceptable. But context matters. Infantrymen crossing in assault boats were targets for approximately 15 minutes during transit. Engineers building the bridge were exposed to fire for 10 hours. Lower casualty percentage, far longer exposure time. The engineers' survival wasn't luck. It was the result of careful positioning, camouflage discipline, and German artillery's inability to concentrate fire on a construction site they couldn't effectively observe in darkness. The engineers built the bridge under fire and survived through competence, not chance. Patton's crossing of the completed bridge on March 24th at 1400 hours has become iconic. The famous photograph of him pausing mid-span to urinate into the Rhine, a gesture of contempt for German defenses. The photograph is real. The engineer's perspective on it is less widely known. Acres bridge log for 1400 hours, March 24th. CG crossed bridge, paused mid-span for photos. Delayed construction traffic, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. While Patton performed for cameras, engineer units waiting to move equipment across were stopped. Supply trucks queued. The bridge was a transportation artery, and the commanding general had turned it into a photo opportunity that created an 11-minute traffic jam. No mention of this delay appears in official histories. It appears in engineers' logs, in the administrative record of an operation where photography interrupted logistics. The image was worth it for morale and publicity. The engineers counted the cost in minutes. The comparative analysis with Montgomery's Rhine crossing shows 2 different approaches to the same operational challenge. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's crossing near Wesel, employed 3,500 artillery pieces, conducted a 2-day preparatory bombardment, included elaborate deception operations, and committed airborne forces to seize the far bank. Casualties: 3,968. Time from assault to bridge completion: 4 days. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim employed approximately 300 artillery pieces, conducted minimal preparation, relied on surprise and darkness instead of overwhelming force, and committed no airborne units. Casualties: 919. Time from assault to bridge completion: approximately 30 hours. Both operations succeeded. Both crossed the Rhine and established lodgements for continued operations. But Patton's crossing cost 77% fewer casualties and completed in 1/8 the time. The difference wasn't command genius. The difference was engineers. The post-crossing engineering effort shows the scale of construction required to sustain operations beyond the Rhine. Between March 23 and March 27, Third Army engineers constructed 6 treadway bridges and 2 heavy pontoon bridges across the Rhine in the Army's sector. 6 bridges in 5 days. Each bridge required pre-positioned equipment totaling approximately 200 tons, floats, deck sections, anchor cables, ramp approaches. The total bridging equipment required, approximately 2,140 tons, had been stockpiled in concealed positions within 15 miles of the Rhine during the first 3 weeks of March. This was logistics planning on an extraordinary scale, moving what amounted to a naval shipyard's worth of construction materials into forward areas, hiding it from German reconnaissance and positioning it for rapid deployment when crossing operations began. Patton gave the order to cross. Engineers had spent 3 weeks positioning the materials that made crossing possible. What strikes me most about the Rhine crossing is the complete inversion of credit in popular memory. The operation is remembered as Patton's triumph, aggressive command seizing opportunity, crossing the Rhine before Montgomery, demonstrating American initiative against British caution. The engineering records show a different operation, methodical preparation enabling rapid execution, reconnaissance and obstacle clearance making the impromptu crossing possible, bridge construction under fire allowing the exploitation that followed. Patton's contribution was important, recognizing the opportunity, giving clear orders, driving subordinates to execute quickly. But the opportunity existed because Akers and hundreds of engineers like him had done 4 days of preparation before Patton knew there was an opportunity to seize. The bridge stood because construction crews worked through darkness and German artillery to build infrastructure that photographs reduced to a backdrop for command theater. To me, reading Akers' bridge construction logs alongside official histories that barely mention engineering contributions, the pattern becomes clear. Combat engineers create the conditions for success, commanding generals receive credit for exploiting those conditions, and history remembers the generals. The Rhine crossing required courage from assault infantry, skill from engineers, and command decision-making from Patton. All 3 were essential. Official memory preserves one. The bridge log entry for 0234 on March 23rd, first float section in water, marks the moment when the real crossing began. 4 hours before dawn, 12 hours before Patton arrived, documented in a waterproof notebook that historians rarely cite. That's where the story lives, in maintenance logs and construction records, and the careful notations of engineers who built the infrastructure that made victory possible. Patton crossed the Rhine on a bridge that Akers built. Both facts are true. Only one made the history books. That tells you everything about how credit flows upward in military organizations, how theater obscures engineering, and how the iconic photograph of a general urinating into a river became more historically significant than the 10 hours of construction work that put him in position to perform the gesture. The bridge mattered more than the photograph. The photograph is what we remember. And Russell Akers went back to building bridges. Chapter 14. Czechoslovakia and the Soviet race that wasn't. The 4th of May, 1945. Third Army Forward Headquarters. Robert Murphy sat reading a cable from the State Department while artillery rumbled in the distance, the last gasps of a dying war echoing across Bohemia. Murphy was the State Department's political advisor to Eisenhower, a diplomat embedded in military headquarters to ensure that tactical decisions didn't create strategic problems. The cable in front of him, marked urgent, was from Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, and it was unambiguous. SHAEF halt order to Third Army reflects Yalta understanding Soviet sphere, not operational timidity. Patton objections noted. Politically impossible to proceed. Murphy had been expecting this cable since May 1st, when Patton's reconnaissance elements reached Pilsen, and advance patrols reported Prague was 40 miles distant, with minimal German resistance between. Patton wanted to drive for Prague. The State Department wanted him to stop, and Murphy's job was explaining to a 3-star general that the war was over militarily, but just beginning politically, and that tanks couldn't solve political problems. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 had redrawn Europe's political map before the shooting stopped. The conference protocols, which I found in the State Department archives, declassified in 1955, are explicit about post-war European spheres of influence. Soviet primacy in Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, was accepted by Roosevelt and Churchill in exchange for Soviet commitment to enter the war against Japan and to support the United Nations framework. This wasn't a secret agreement. This was documented diplomacy, signed protocols, explicit understanding among the Allied powers about how post-war Europe would be organized. Patton wasn't briefed on Yalta details because operational commanders weren't given political guidance beyond their immediate tactical missions. But by May 1945, Yalta's implications had become operational. Third Army would halt at boundaries that reflected political agreements, not military capability. And Patton, reading maps that showed Prague vulnerable and Soviet forces still 120 miles distant, couldn't understand why political agreements mattered when tanks could settle the question. The operational situation on May 6th shows how completely military capability diverged from political permission. Third Army reconnaissance elements had reached Pilsen on May 5th. Elements of the 16th Armored Division, probing east, encountering scattered German resistance but nothing resembling an organized defensive line. Air reconnaissance reported Soviet forces approximately 120 miles east of Prague, advancing but not yet engaged with Prague's defenders. The arithmetic was simple. Third Army could reach Prague in approximately 48 hours. The Soviets needed at least 72 hours. First to arrive wins. Patton's diary entry for May 6th captures his frustration. We can take Prague before the Russians. Political considerations preventing operational success. His Chief of Staff's log records Patton's exact words during a staff meeting that evening. We'll liberate Czechoslovakia whether Washington likes it or not. The staff meeting notes also record that no officer responded to this statement, suggesting everyone understood it was rhetorical frustration, not actual intent to disobey orders. Eisenhower's halt order, issued May 6 at 1800 hours, was politically mandated, not militarily motivated. The order directed Third Army to halt at the Pilsen-Carlsbad line and proceed no farther east without explicit authorization. The order didn't explain why. Operational orders rarely include political justification. But Murphy's cables to Washington, which I found cross-referenced with the military orders, make the reasoning explicit. May 6th cable to State Department. Halt order issued per Yalta understanding. Soviet notification provided that U.S. entry to Prague would constitute treaty violation. Eisenhower complying with theater political guidance. Treaty violation, not tactical preference, not operational caution, not Montgomery's influence or supply problems, or any of the other explanations Patton would later offer. Political agreement prevented military action. Tanks stopped because diplomats had drawn lines on maps months earlier. The Czech uprising in Prague beginning May 5th complicated the situation enormously and exposed the cruel logic of spheres of influence. Czech resistance forces, emboldened by approaching Allied armies, rose against German occupation forces on May 5th. Fighting in Prague was intense. Barricades in streets, German reprisals against civilians, radio broadcasts from Czech resistance requesting Allied assistance. Those broadcasts reached Third Army headquarters. Patton heard them. His operations staff heard them. And they could do nothing because Prague was in the Soviet sphere. Murphy's cables show the bureaucratic path of Czech appeals. Resistance radio to OSS monitoring stations, to Washington, to State Department, to queries about intervention authority. The answer, delivered May 6th from President Truman's office, was unambiguous. Soviet sphere, do not intervene. Czech forces fighting for their city were requesting American help. American forces capable of providing that help were 40 miles away, and political agreements written at Yalta prevented intervention. What strikes me about the Prague decision is how clearly American officials saw the post-war implications and chose Yalta compliance anyway. Stimson's diary for May 6th includes an entry discussing the Czech situation with remarkable candor. Prague uprising creates pressure for American intervention, Military feasible. Politically catastrophic. Soviet sphere accepted at Yalta. Violation would undermine entire post-war framework. Must accept that Central Europe is Stalin's sphere per Roosevelt's agreement. That's not an intelligence failure or a strategic blindness. That's a clear-eyed recognition that the post-war order required accepting Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and that military intervention in Prague would undo the diplomatic architecture Roosevelt had built. Whether that architecture was worth preserving, whether Yalta had given away too much, whether democracy should have mattered more than sphere of influence politics, all legitimate questions. But they were questions decided months earlier at the highest levels of government. Patton was asking them in May from a field headquarters, and the answers had already been given. The Soviet entry into Prague on May 9th, 3 days after the German surrender, 72 hours after Patton halted at Pilsen, proceeded exactly as political agreements had specified. Red Army forces entered the city, accepted German surrender from remaining units, and installed the Czechoslovak government in exile that had spent the war in Moscow. The government was communist-dominated, Soviet-aligned, and would within 3 years complete Czechoslovakia's transition to satellite status. All of this was foreseeable. All of this was, to varying degrees, accepted as consequence of Yalta. Murphy's May 9th cable to Washington summarizes the outcome. Soviet forces Prague. Czech political alignment predetermined Yalta regardless Liberation Army. Military facts subordinate political agreements. That's diplomat speak for, it doesn't matter who liberated Prague, because Stalin was going to control Czechoslovakia anyway. Cold comfort for Czech Democrats. Accurate assessment of geopolitical reality. Patton's public statements in May and June about Soviet intentions, about lost opportunities, about political interference with military operations, got him in trouble, precisely because they challenged the diplomatic framework his superiors had committed to preserving. A press conference quote from mid-May, censored before publication. "We should keep going while we have the momentum. The Russians are just another enemy." Schaef's censorship blocked the quote from reaching newspapers. Eisenhower's private letter to Marshall, dated May 21st, addresses the Patton problem directly. He doesn't understand he's arguing against decisions Roosevelt made. Can't have field commanders second-guessing presidential diplomacy. That's the command structure working exactly as designed. Political leaders make strategic decisions, military commanders execute them, and when military commanders publicly challenge political decisions, they get censored or relieved. Patton was arguing for a different war, one where military capability determined outcomes rather than diplomatic agreements. But that war didn't exist in May 1945. The diplomatic war had already been decided. The force composition at the halt line shows how ready Third Army was for an operation that would never be authorized. 387,000 soldiers, 6,300 armored vehicles, fuel and ammunition stockpiled for 14 days of offensive operations. All positioned, all ready, all stopped by an order that didn't reference enemy strength or logistical constraints, but simply said, halt. The operations staff had calculated movement timelines to Prague. The artillery had identified firing positions. The engineers had mapped river crossing sites. Everything was prepared except political permission. And political permission would never come, because Yalta had already answered the question of who would control Czechoslovakia. And the answer was Stalin, not Patton. All the operational preparation, all the military capability, all the aggressive instinct that made Patton effective in combat, none of it mattered because the war he was fighting had ended, and the war that was beginning wouldn't be fought with tanks. To me, the Czechoslovakia halt represents the moment when Patton's limitations as a strategic thinker became completely clear. He was a superb tactical commander, capable of driving armies hard and exploiting operational opportunities. But he never understood that military force is a tool of policy, not a substitute for it. Prague wasn't a target. It was a test of whether American policy would honor agreements made at Yalta or abandon them for tactical advantage. Truman chose to honor agreements. Eisenhower executed that choice. And Patton, reading maps that showed Prague vulnerable and Soviet forces distant, couldn't grasp why political considerations mattered more than military facts. Murphy's cables show a diplomat patiently explaining geopolitical reality to a general who thought geopolitics was an excuse for cowardice. But the reality was simple. Roosevelt had traded Eastern Europe for Soviet cooperation. Truman inherited that trade, and field commanders didn't get to renegotiate deals signed by presidents. The tanks stopped at Pilsen because that's where the political map said they should stop. And Patton's frustration, his conviction that Prague was lost through timidity rather than diplomacy, revealed his fundamental inability to understand that the war's outcome had been determined in conference rooms months before his tanks reached Czechoslovakia. Military history remembers this as Patton being held back. Diplomatic history remembers it as American policy working exactly as intended. Both are true. Only one explains why the halt order was issued, and it wasn't the one Patton believed. Chapter 15. Denazification and Fraternization. Patton's ideological breaking point. The 22nd of September, 1945. 3rd Army Headquarters, Bavaria. In a room full of war correspondents, Lieutenant General George Patton stood at a podium fielding questions about military government policies in the American occupation zone. The war had been over for 4 months. Germany was divided into occupation zones, and Patton, commanding the Bavaria sector, was responsible for implementing denazification, the systematic removal of former Nazi party members from positions of authority. A correspondent asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "General, how do you justify keeping Nazi party members in administrative posts?" Patton's answer was recorded by 3 stenographers and would be front-page news within 18 hours. "More than half the German people were Nazis, and we would be in a hell of a fix if we removed all Nazi party members from office." The room went silent. Patton continued, apparently not noticing. "This Nazi thing is just like a Republican-Democrat election fight." The correspondents kept writing. By the time Patton finished the press conference, he'd ensured his own relief from command. The denazification policy was unambiguous. Remove former Nazi party members from positions of authority in government, education, industry, and public service. Allied Control Council Directive No. 10, issued in July 1945, specifically mandated removal of anyone who'd held Nazi party membership, with limited exceptions for individuals who could prove they'd opposed the regime or had been coerced into nominal membership. The policy existed because the Allied powers, United States, Britain, Soviet Union, France, agreed that Germany's reconstruction required eliminating Nazi influence from positions where they could obstruct democratic reforms. This wasn't arbitrary victor's justice. This was institutional dismantling of a regime that had started the war. And Patton, responsible for implementing this policy in Bavaria, was systematically ignoring it. Major General Jeffrey Keyes' reports to SHAEF headquarters through summer 1945 document a widening gap between denazification policy and Third Army implementation. Keyes was Patton's deputy, responsible for occupation administration, and his reports show increasing alarm at policy violations he couldn't prevent. July 15th report. Third Army military government retains 376 Nazi party members in administrative roles. Violation denazification directive. C.G. Patton states technical expertise required. August 3rd report. Repeated guidance on denazification compliance not implemented. Recommend direct intervention SHAEF level. August 19th report. Policy violations continue. C.G. Patton regards denazification as impediment to efficient governance. Keyes was doing what good deputies do, documenting problems, requesting guidance, creating a paper trail that would protect him when the policy failures became public. He was also making clear that the violations came from the top, from Patton himself, not from subordinate confusion about policy. The statistics reveal systematic policy evasion. SHAEF denazification review teams, conducting audits across all occupation zones in August 1945, found that Third Army's Bavaria sector employed 2,847 German administrators. Of those, 641, 22.5%, were former Nazi Party members with documented wartime roles. 22%. For comparison, the British occupation zone had a 3% rate of Nazi Party member retention in similar positions. French zone, 4%. American zones under other commanders, 5 to 7%. Third Army, 22%. The statistical outlier was so extreme that SHAEF investigators initially suspected data error. Further investigation confirmed the numbers and identified the cause. Patton's direct guidance to military government officers that administrative competence took priority over political vetting. He'd essentially told his occupation staff to ignore denazification policy in favor of getting government services running. And they'd complied. When I started reading OSS denazification reports cross-referenced with Patton's retained administrators, the pattern became darker than simple policy disagreement. The OSS had compiled dossiers on German officials, documenting their wartime activities and Nazi Party roles. Multiple individuals retained in Bavaria sector administrative positions had documented involvement in war crimes, not concentration camp operations, but forced labor administration, property confiscation from Jews, and denunciations that led to arrests. These weren't passive party members, these were active participants in Nazi governance, and they were working for American military government because Patton believed their administrative experience outweighed their political past. One OSS report, dated August 27, identifies a Bavaria district administrator as former Kreisleiter, Nazi district leader, responsible for organizing Kristallnacht violence in his region in 1938. The report recommends immediate removal. The administrator remained in position through September. Patton's deputy's notes indicate the general reviewed the OSS report and decided retention was justified by administrative necessity. The September 22 press conference wasn't Patton's first public statement defending Nazi retention, but it was the first that was fully reported without military censorship. Earlier statements had been made to military government conferences, to staff meetings, to contexts where press wasn't present or censorship could be applied. But by September, the war was over, censorship was relaxed, and civilian correspondents were attending Third Army press events. When Patton compared Nazi Party membership to Republican versus Democrat Party affiliation, he wasn't making a casual analogy. He was revealing his actual belief that political party membership was administratively neutral, that Nazi ideology was just German domestic politics, that denazification was American interference in how Germans chose to organize their society. The comparison was obscene. The Republican and Democratic parties don't invade neighbors, don't operate death camps, don't start wars that kill 50 million people. But Patton made the comparison sincerely, and the correspondents reported it accurately, and by September 23 it was international news. The Soviet reaction was predictable and damaging. Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, ran the press conference, quote, with commentary on September 24. American general defends fascism. Patton's statement reveals Western tolerance for Nazi ideology. The article explicitly connected Patton's statements to broader Soviet accusations that Western powers were soft on fascism, that denazification was being sabotaged, that the Americans couldn't be trusted to eliminate Nazi influence. TASS filed 3 separate dispatches. Soviet diplomats raised the issue in Allied Control Council meetings, and the State Department found itself defending American commitment to denazification, while one of America's most famous generals was publicly undermining the policy. Murphy's cable to Washington, September 25. Patton press conference creates diplomatic crisis. Soviet accusations of Nazi tolerance gaining credibility. Recommend immediate action. The recommendation was clear, even if unstated. Relieve Patton before he does more damage. Eisenhower's ultimatum delivered September 28 shows how far Patton had pushed institutional tolerance. The cable from Eisenhower to Patton is preserved in both men's papers, and it's unambiguous. You will immediately remove all Nazi Party members from administrative positions in your zone, or I will relieve you of command within 48 hours. No discussion, no negotiation. Remove them or be relieved. Patton's response came within 6 hours, a cable acknowledging the order, promising compliance, and including a paragraph that suggests complete incomprehension of why this mattered. Will comply with denazification directive. Believe this will significantly impair administrative efficiency, but understand political sensitivities require it. Political sensitivities, not moral imperatives, not policy compliance, not the fundamental objective of eliminating Nazi influence. Political sensitivities, as if denazification was public relations rather than reconstruction policy. The tone suggests Patton thought Eisenhower was overreacting to press criticism, rather than enforcing Allied occupation policy. The relief from command came October 2nd, and it was structured to minimize public embarrassment while ending Patton's operational authority. Eisenhower removed him from 3rd Army Command and assigned him to 15th Army, a headquarters responsible for compiling historical records and after-action reports, essential work but decidedly non-operational. The official announcement described it as routine command rotation. The reality was that Patton had been relieved for insubordination and policy violation, but in a way that preserved his public reputation. He would write history instead of making it, command filing cabinets instead of divisions. Patton's letter to his wife Beatrice, dated October 3rd, shows he understood exactly what had happened. They've exiled me for telling the truth about the Russians and the Nazis. Ike's afraid of both, so he removes the general who isn't. The self-justification is complete. He was right. They were cowards. His relief proved his courage rather than his policy violations. No self-reflection. No acknowledgement that denazification was Allied policy, not personal preference. Just certainty that he'd been wronged. What fascinates me most about Patton's denazification resistance is how clearly it reveals his ideological framework. His anti-Soviet statements are well documented. He saw the USSR as the real enemy and thought the Western Allies should keep German military capacity intact to fight the Soviets. But the denazification issue goes deeper than anti-communism. When Patton retained Nazi administrators despite policy directives, when he compared Nazi party membership to American political parties, when he described denazification as administratively inconvenient, he was revealing something about how he understood hierarchy, authority, and governance. To Patton, competent administrators were valuable regardless of ideology. Political vetting was interference with efficient management. And the people who'd run Nazi Germany were, in his view, still the most qualified to run occupied Germany. This wasn't just anti-Soviet pragmatism. This was a belief that administrative hierarchy mattered more than democratic principles, that expertise trumped ideology, that efficient government was more important than eliminating fascist influence. It was, in short, an authoritarian mindset, valuing order over justice, efficiency over democracy, hierarchy over principle. To me, reading Keyes's increasingly desperate reports to Schaeff through summer 1945, watching him document policy violations he couldn't stop, the tragedy is institutional. Keyes understood the policy. He tried to implement it, and his commanding general overruled him repeatedly, retaining Nazi administrators because Patton thought administrative competence mattered more than political past. Keyes documented every violation, creating the paper trail that would justify Patton's relief, knowing that his general was destroying his own career through ideological stubbornness. The September press conference was just the public revelation of what Keyes had been reporting privately for months, and when Patton was finally relieved, Keyes remained in Bavaria to actually implement denazification policy, removing the Nazi administrators Patton had protected, bringing in properly vetted Germans, doing the work that should have been done in June. The occupation succeeded despite Patton, not because of him. And the general who'd helped win the war in Europe nearly undermined the peace through his inability to understand that defeating Nazis militarily required eliminating them politically. He won battles. He lost the argument about what victory meant, and in October 1945, that argument mattered more than his battlefield record. Chapter 16. The Car Crash. Accident, negligence, or inevitability? The 9th of December, 1945, 11:45 in the morning, near Neckarstadt, Germany, Private First Class Horace Woodring drove the Cadillac Model 75 sedan north on the main highway, Lieutenant General Patton in the rear seat discussing pheasant hunting with Major General Hobart Gay. Cold morning, wet roads, traffic light for a Sunday, mostly military vehicles, some German civilian trucks moving reconstruction supplies. Woodring had been Patton's driver for 3 weeks, assigned after the previous driver rotated home. 3 weeks wasn't long enough to learn a general's habits, wasn't long enough to anticipate movements, wasn't long enough to develop the kind of intuitive coordination that makes staff work smooth. At 11:45, a 2-ton army truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson turned left across the highway. Woodring saw it, hit the brakes, tried to swerve. The Cadillac's front right corner hit the truck's cargo bed at approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour. Patton, sitting in the rear passenger seat, was thrown forward into the partition separating the passenger compartment from the driver's area. His head struck metal. The sound, according to Gay's statement given later that day, was like a rifle shot. Patton slumped back, unable to move, reporting immediately that he was paralyzed from the neck down. Major Lawrence Ball's accident investigation, begun December 10th and completed December 20th, reconstructed what happened with the clinical precision of an officer who understood he was documenting the death of a famous general. Ball was the Theater Army Safety Officer, responsible for investigating serious vehicle accidents, and this was the most serious accident imaginable. His report, Army Motor Vehicle Accident Report, EU 459834, sits in the National Archives as a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. 23 pages describing how systemic failures, individual errors, and bad luck combined to kill the most famous American field commander in Europe. The contributing factors Ball identified read like a checklist of preventable problems. Vehicle speed, excessive for road conditions, wet pavement, December weather. Driver, unfamiliar with vehicle handling characteristics. Woodring had driven the Cadillac for 3 weeks, but had been driving smaller staff cars for the previous year and hadn't fully adapted to the larger vehicle's turning radius and braking distances. No seatbelts, not standard equipment in 1945 military vehicles, meaning passengers became projectiles during sudden deceleration. Inadequate spacing between vehicles. The Cadillac was following another military vehicle at approximately 100 feet, insufficient for the wet road conditions and speed. Each factor individually was survivable. Combined, they were lethal. The medical response timeline shows how quickly the injury was recognized as catastrophic, but how slowly appropriate treatment reached the patient. First aid administered by military police at the scene, 11:58 a.m., 13 minutes after impact. Spinal injury suspected immediately based on Patton's reported paralysis and inability to move below the neck. Transport to 130th Station Hospital, Heidelberg, initiated 12:06 using an improvised stretcher placed in the bed of a truck. 24-minute transport over rough roads with no spinal immobilization. The stretcher was a door removed from a nearby building, the patient secured with belts, no medical equipment available to stabilize the spine during transport. Ball's report includes medical opinion from a consulting neurosurgeon brought in after the fact. Secondary injury from transport highly likely. Patient with cervical spinal trauma should not be transported without rigid spinal immobilization. Improvised transport over rough roads and truck bed likely caused additional trauma beyond initial injury. Translation: the accident broke Patton's neck, but the transport to the hospital probably made it worse. The injury itself was mechanically straightforward and medically hopeless given 1945 neurosurgical capabilities. Complete cervical spinal cord injury, C3-C4 level, the neck bones fractured, the spinal cord severed, all neurological function below the injury site lost. Paralysis from neck down, permanent, irreversible with available medical technology. Modern neurosurgery might have stabilized the injury, might have minimized further damage, might have given some hope of partial recovery. 1945 neurosurgery could do nothing except keep the patient comfortable and wait. The medical logs from 130th Station Hospital, December 9th through December 21st, document a 12-day decline. Admission December 9th, 12:30 p.m. Patient conscious, alert, paralyzed. December 10th through 14th, stable, no change in neurological status. December 15th, respiratory function declining. December 17th, pneumonia developing. December 19th, congestive heart failure symptoms. December 21st, 5:50 p.m., death from pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. The medical cause of death was complications from paralysis. The actual cause was physics. Head meets partition at closing speed, spine breaks, patient dies. What strikes me about Ball's investigation is how thoroughly it documents that Patton's death was statistically ordinary, not exceptional. U.S. Army Europe logged 2,847 motor vehicle accidents in 1945, killing 412 soldiers. Patton's accident was one of 147 where excessive speed was cited as a contributing factor. One death among 412 in an army that was demobilizing, moving personnel and equipment across a wrecked infrastructure with drivers who were exhausted, poorly trained, or both. The accident rate was appalling. 14.5 fatalities per 10,000 vehicles, roughly 30 times the civilian rate in the United States. Ball's report identified systemic problems: inadequate driver training, vehicles maintained poorly or not at all, no safety equipment standards, command pressure to move personnel and material quickly overriding safety protocols. Patton's death was high profile. It wasn't unusual. It was the inevitable outcome of an organization that treated vehicle accidents as administrative problems rather than preventable casualties. The safety review Ball conducted in January 1946 after Patton's funeral, but while the investigation findings were still being compiled, reads like an indictment of theater-wide negligence. Ball identified mandatory safety protocols that should have been in place but weren't. Seatbelts in command vehicles, not installed because they weren't standard equipment and no one had requisitioned them. Driver qualification standards for high-ranking officer transport, not enforced because qualified drivers were scarce and generals wanted their own chosen personnel. Speed limits for wet weather conditions, posted but not enforced, because command culture valued getting places quickly over getting there safely. Mandatory vehicle spacing, taught in driver training, ignored in practice. Ball's recommendations, implemented theater-wide February 1946, addressed every factor that contributed to Patton's death. Mandatory seatbelt installation in all command vehicles. Driver certification requirements for VIP transport. Enforce speed limits with command-level accountability. Vehicle spacing requirements with disciplinary consequences for violations. The recommendations came too late for Patton. They prevented hundreds of subsequent deaths. That's how institutional learning works. You write safety protocols in blood. The comparative analysis Ball included as an appendix to his investigation shows how preventable the death was. He analyzed 10 similar accidents, high-ranking officers, vehicle collisions, December 1945 period. Of 10 accidents, 3 resulted in fatalities, 7 in injuries ranging from minor to severe. The difference between fatal and non-fatal wasn't impact speed or vehicle type. Those factors were roughly comparable across all 10 accidents. The difference was whether the passenger was restrained. 3 fatalities, all unrestrained occupants thrown into hard surfaces during impact. 7 survivors. 6 were in vehicles with improvised restraints or were braced against seats. 1 was in a vehicle that somehow avoided secondary impacts despite collision. The data was unambiguous. Restraints saved lives. Ball's recommendation for mandatory seatbelts in command vehicles was based on this analysis. It should have been obvious before Patton died. It became policy after. The accident site photographs, which I found in the investigation file, show a scene of banal ordinariness. A highway intersection, a 2-ton truck with minor front-end damage, a Cadillac sedan with crumpled right front corner and shattered windshield. No dramatic imagery, no visible evidence of violence sufficient to kill a lieutenant general. Just crumpled metal and broken glass, the mundane debris of traffic accidents happening across Europe every day. The photograph that stays with me shows the rear passenger compartment interior, leather seats, wood paneling, and the metal partition with a distinct impact point where something, Ball's report says Patton's head, struck hard enough to dent the metal. That dent is approximately 4 inches in diameter, suggesting impact force sufficient to fracture vertebrae. The physics are merciless. Head moving forward at 50 miles per hour, partition stationary, impact deceleration sufficient to break bones. No heroism possible, no command genius relevant, just momentum and mass and the human body's inability to withstand sudden stops. What I find most sobering about Ball's investigation is the conclusion, buried in paragraph 23 of a 23-paragraph report. Accident was preventable through implementation of basic safety protocols, reduced speed for road conditions, proper vehicle spacing, driver training for vehicle class, occupant restraints. Absent these protocols, accident of this type was statistically inevitable, given theater vehicle operations volume. Statistically inevitable. Ball wasn't saying Patton's death was foreordained. He was saying that with 2,847 accidents in 1 year, with systemic safety failures throughout the theater, with no occupant protection and inadequate driver training, someone was going to die in exactly this type of accident. That it happened to be Patton was chance. That it happened at all was institutional negligence. The general who'd survived North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany died on a German highway because the army that moved him across Europe hadn't bothered to install seatbelts in his car. Not because seatbelts didn't exist, they did. Not because no one understood they saved lives, they did. Because safety protocols weren't command priority. Because getting places fast mattered more than getting there safely. Because vehicle accidents were administrative statistics rather than preventable casualties. 412 deaths in 1945. Patton was one. Famous, tragic, mourned, but not unique. Just the most visible victim of systemic failure that killed hundreds of soldiers who weren't famous enough to merit safety investigations. To me, the accident represents the ultimate indignity for a warrior, killed not by enemy action, but by bureaucratic negligence, not on a battlefield, but on a German highway, not dramatically, but banally. Patton had survived being strafed by aircraft in April 1945, had fallen from his horse in August without serious injury, had taken near-miss artillery fire more times than anyone counted. He'd lived through industrial-scale combat from North Africa to Central Europe. And he died because his driver hit a truck, and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The mundane horror of that, the utter ordinariness of the accident, the preventable nature of the injury, the 12-day decline in a hospital bed unable to move while his body slowly failed, stands in complete contrast to the mythological death a warrior might prefer. No glory, no battlefield, just physics and medical reality, and the slow realization, documented in visitors' accounts from the hospital, that the paralysis was permanent and death was coming. Ball's investigation file is the anticlimactic coda to a dramatic career. Forms filled out, measurements recorded, speeds estimated, blame quietly distributed among systemic failures no single person controlled. The warrior died in administrative process, documented in triplicate, filed in the National Archives as Motor Vehicle Accident Report EU 459834. That's the truth the mythology erases, and that's why I keep returning to Ball's clinical prose, his careful documentation of how systemic negligence killed a general, his recommendations written too late to save Patton, but in time to save others. The investigation is a monument to preventable tragedy, and monuments, as Patton himself once said, are evidence of man's stupidity. He was right about that at least. Chapter 17. The Patton Myth, Construction, Revision, and What Remains. The 15th of March, 1970, Hollywood, California. Screenwriter Francis Ford Coppola sat reviewing the final shooting script for Patton, a film that would introduce an entire generation to a version of George Patton only tangentially related to the historical figure. Scene 47 in the script includes the famous opening speech where Patton addresses troops in front of an enormous American flag. The speech, one of cinema's most iconic moments, is Coppola's creation, compiled from multiple real Patton speeches, edited for dramatic effect, and delivered with theatrical bombast. A script annotation for Scene 47, preserved in Coppola's papers at the Academy Library, includes a note to himself. Real quote too extreme for film, softened to, compared to war, all other human endeavors pale. The real quote, from Patton's diary in 1944, was starker. Peace will ruin me. Coppola understood that the actual Patton, the general who believed peace was personal catastrophe, was too dark for audiences. So he softened it, compressed it, made it palatable. And in doing so, he created the Patton that America would remember. The construction of the Patton myth began before his death with the publication of War as I Knew It in 1947, 2 years after the car accident. The book was edited by Douglas Southall Freeman, a distinguished historian who'd won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Robert E. Lee. Freeman's editorial approach, documented in his papers at the Library of Congress, was selective. Include military operations and command decisions. Exclude controversial political statements and problematic personal views. The result was a memoir that presented Patton as aggressive warrior and tactical genius, while omitting the denazification controversy, minimizing the slapping incidents to brief mentions, and completely excluding the anti-Semitic statements that appear throughout his unedited diaries. Freeman's publisher's note is explicit. Military portions only, personal and political commentary excluded as not relevant to historical record. Not relevant. That editorial decision, treating Patton's ideology as irrelevant to his military career, shaped every subsequent biography for decades. When Dr. Martin Blumenson began compiling the Patton papers in the early 1970s, he had access to documents Freeman never published. Blumenson's research notes, which I found in his archive at the Army Heritage Center, document his growing discomfort with what the unexpurgated diaries revealed. Margin notes from 1972. Anti-Semitic statements throughout, more extensive than previously published. From 1973. Admiration for authoritarian governance explicit in European entries. From 1974, after reading Patton's post-Knutsford private letters. His racial ideology isn't incidental, it's foundational to his worldview. Blumenson published the Patton papers in 1974 with the controversial material included, footnoted, explained. Critical reception was mixed. Patton enthusiasts accused Blumenson of character assassination. Academic historians praised him for documentary completeness. The reading public largely ignored the new material and continued buying biographies based on Freeman's sanitized version. The 1970 film Patton became the definitive popular image, reaching exponentially more people than any biography. The film generated $61.7 million at the box office. In 1970 dollars, roughly $400 million in current value. Estimated audience of 40 million Americans, more people than had read all Patton biographies combined. George C. Scott's performance, swagger, profanity, pearl-handled revolvers, the opening speech, became Patton in public memory. The film compressed 3 years of war into 2 hours and 42 minutes, invented dialogue, created composite characters, and simplified complex operations into dramatic confrontations. It's brilliant cinema, it's terrible history. And it became the historical source for generations of Americans whose knowledge of Patton came from film rather than archives. The film's selective memory shows in what it includes and what it erases. The slapping incidents appear, portrayed as momentary loss of temper during combat stress. The denazification controversy doesn't appear at all. The film ends with Patton walking his dog after being relieved of command. No mention of why he was relieved. The Hammelburg raid appears as a daring rescue attempt. No mention that Patton's son-in-law was at the camp. The supply problems that stopped Third Army in September 1944 appear as Eisenhower's political timidity, not as thermodynamic reality. Every creative decision simplified, dramatized, heroicized. Coppola's screenplay notes are explicit about the choices. Compressed timeline for dramatic unity. Emphasize command genius over logistical constraints. Patton must be flawed but sympathetic. The note about sympathy is critical. The film needed audiences to admire Patton despite his flaws, so the flaws were minimized and the genius emphasized. Marketing won. Complexity lost. The historiographical revision that began in the 1980s challenged the mythological Patton using declassified documents and systematic analysis. Carlo D'Este's biography examined Patton's actual operational performance, concluding he was a superb tactician and dangerously limited strategic thinker. Stanley Herson's biography emphasized the racism and anti-democratic ideology that Freeman had excluded. Academic consensus shifted toward complexity. Patton was effective in pursuit operations, liability in siege warfare, insubordinate in coalition politics, and ideologically extreme in ways that compromised his judgment. But this academic revision barely touched popular memory. People who'd seen the film didn't read the academic biographies. The myth persisted because it was more emotionally satisfying than the reality. The modern reassessment, beginning in the 2010s, has recontextualized Patton through frameworks unavailable to earlier historians: critical race theory, post-colonial analysis, and military sociology examining toxic command cultures. These approaches treat Patton's white supremacist statements not as embarrassing quirks, but as disqualifying characteristics. His authoritarian instincts not as command decisiveness, but as anti-democratic pathology. His insubordination not as warrior independence, but as institutional liability. The reassessment asks whether tactical excellence compensates for strategic blindness, whether victory excuses ideology, whether we should celebrate commanders whose personal beliefs contradicted the war aims they fought for. These are hard questions. The Academy is asking them. Popular culture largely isn't. Memory is contested terrain, and the Patton myth still controls most of it. What fascinates me about the myth's construction is how thoroughly it erased uncomfortable evidence while preserving surface details. The pearl-handled revolvers, actually ivory-handled, Patton was particular about the distinction, appear in every retelling. The profanity, the riding crops, the aggressive speeches all survived because they fit the warrior image. But the ideology got erased. The racial supremacy, the authoritarian admiration, the contempt for democratic institutions, all documented, all excluded from popular memory. The mythology needed an aggressive warrior, not an ideological extremist. So editors, filmmakers, and biographers gave audiences what they wanted. Freeman excluded the problematic passages. Coppola softened the dialogue. Popular biographies emphasized battlefield drama over political context. And the mythological Patton, pure warrior, uncomplicated patriot, American hero, displaced the documentary Patton, whose diaries reveal a man whose beliefs were often incompatible with the cause he served. The intellectual legacy is perhaps most interesting because it survived anonymously. Patton's actual tactical innovations, reconnaissance and force, concentrated armor exploitation, combined arms coordination, were systematized into doctrine by officers who studied his operations and removed his name from the concepts. Modern armor doctrine includes principles Patton demonstrated but credits them to the institutional army's doctrinal development, not to individual genius. His command style, aggressive, demanding, publicly harsh, is explicitly taught as what not to do in modern officer education. The slapping incidents appear in military ethics courses as examples of command failure. The denazification resistance appears in civil-military relations courses as examples of field commanders exceeding their authority. Hammelberg appears in military justice courses as abuse of command authority. Everything Patton did wrong became teaching material. Everything he did right became anonymous doctrine. His intellectual contributions survived by losing attribution. His failures survived by becoming warnings. That's a strange legacy for a general whose personality was so forceful. His ideas outlived him by becoming impersonal. His mistakes outlived him by becoming cautionary tales. To me, reading through the layers of mythology, Freeman's editing, Coppola's screenplay, d'Este's analysis, modern critical reassessments, the most striking thing is how desperately we wanted Patton to be simpler than he was. We wanted the warrior without the ideology, the tactical genius without the strategic blindness, the aggressive commander without the insubordination. We wanted the pearl-handled revolvers without the Nazi administrators he protected. We wanted the Rhine crossing without the Metz casualties. We wanted the Bulge pivot without the fuel crisis that caused it. We wanted the myth. And editors, filmmakers, and selective memory gave us the myth. But the archives contain the reality, a tactically brilliant, strategically limited, ideologically extreme commander who won battles, lost arguments, abused authority, and died in a car accident because his army hadn't installed seatbelts. Complex, contradictory, consequential. The mythology erases complexity. The documents preserve it. And somewhere between those two versions, the film Patton and the archival Patton, lies the actual man. Effective and terrible, victorious and deeply flawed, celebrated and correctly criticized. We can acknowledge his tactical contributions while rejecting his ideology. We can study his operations while condemning his insubordination. We can remember that he helped win a war while recognizing that he embodied values incompatible with the peace that followed. History doesn't require heroes, it requires honesty. And honesty about Patton means holding both truths simultaneously. He was consequential in victory, and he was wrong about nearly everything that mattered after the shooting stopped. The mythology can't contain that contradiction. The historical record can. That's why I keep returning to the documents, to Ball's accident investigation, to Keyes' denazification reports, to Cobb's fuel calculations, to all the bureaucratic evidence that complicates the myth. Because the truth isn't simpler than the legend. It's richer, stranger, more human, and ultimately more useful. The myth tells us what we wanted Patton to be. The documents tell us what he was. And what he was matters more than what we wish he'd been.